all profits after that. And I won't tell you what we own because that's distracting. All I want to do is hand in a scorecard when I come off the golf course. I don't want you following me around and watching me shank a 3-iron on this hole and leave a putt short on the next one. His partners accepted the conditions because they knew he was totally committed to investing. Says Omaha investment banker Charles Hyder, I told my family, look, Warren is going to think about how to invest our money 7 days a week. Buffett dug for information where other investment managers hardly pawed. Take, for instance, his work on American Express in 1963 during the Salad Oil affair. The company's stock had tanked after it was discovered that a subsidiary might be liable for tens of millions of dollars in damage claims arising from the sale of salad oil that did not exist. Buffett and his people determined by visiting retailers that the core business of the credit cards and travelers' checks was as profitable as ever. That convinced him he should load up on the battered stock. It quintupled in 5 years. Like all master craftsmen, Buffett prizes consistency. Marshall Weinberg of the brokerage firm Gruntle & Company recalls going to dinner with him in Manhattan. He had an exceptional ham and cheese sandwich. A few days later, we were going out again. He said, let's go back to that restaurant. I said, but we were just there. He said, precisely. Why take a risk with another place? We know exactly what we're going to get. And that, says Weinberg, is what Warren looks for in stocks, too. He only invests in companies where the odds are great that they will not disappoint.
How I Goofed, April 9, 1990. An excerpt from Buffett's letter to shareholders in the 1989 Berkshire Hathaway Annual Report. Typically, around 80% of Warren Buffett's annual chairman's letter is Berkshire-specific. The remainder is op-ed, Buffett style. It turns out that excerpts from either portion may work nicely as a Fortune article, and we proved that over the years by turning 6 varied excerpts from the letters into articles, with this one the first. In Berkshire's annual report, we will note, the excerpt printed here had a different title, referring implicitly to Buffett's quarter-century at the helm of Berkshire. It was called Mistakes of the First 25 Years, a condensed version. Our title instead summed things up as How I Goofed. The content of the piece, a CEO pointing out his errors, was obviously unusual, extraordinarily so for an annual report. Of course, it is relatively easy to engage in a confessional when you run a company whose stock has risen more than 400 times in the 25 years at issue, going from about $18 per share to $7,450. Even so, Buffett says in this piece that the record could have been even better, had he just not been so dumb in certain instances. As this book is published in 2012, we are only 3 years away from the 50-year managerial mark for Buffett, at which point he has promised to once again catalog his mistakes. Quote, I will not lack for material, he told me recently. C.L.
To quote Robert Benchley, having a dog teaches a boy fidelity, perseverance, and to turn around 3 times before lying down. Such are the shortcomings of experience. Nevertheless, it's a good idea to review past mistakes before committing new ones. So, let's take a quick look at the last 25 years. My first mistake, of course, was in buying control of Berkshire. Though I knew its business, textile manufacturing, to be unpromising, I was enticed to buy because the price looked cheap. Stock prices of that kind had proved reasonably rewarding in my early years, though by the time Berkshire came along in 1965, I was becoming aware that the strategy was not ideal. If you buy a stock at a sufficiently low price, There will usually be some hiccup in the fortunes of the business that gives you a chance to unload at a decent profit, even though the long-term performance of the business may be terrible. I call this the cigar butt approach to investing. A cigar butt found on the street that has only one puff left on it may not offer much of a smoke, but the bargain purchase will make that puff all profit. Unless you are a liquidator, that kind of approach to buying businesses is foolish. First, the original bargain price probably will not turn out to be such a steal after all. In a difficult business, no sooner is one problem solved than another surfaces. Never is there just one cockroach in the kitchen. Second, any initial advantage you secure will be quickly eroded by the low return that the business earns. For example, if you buy a business for $8 million that can be sold or liquidated for $10 million, and promptly take either course, you can realize a high return. But the investment will disappoint if the business is sold for $10 million in 10 years, and in the interim has annually earned and distributed only a few % on cost. Time is the friend of the wonderful business, the enemy of the mediocre. You might think this principle is obvious, but I had to learn it the hard way. In fact, I had to learn it several times over. Shortly after purchasing Berkshire, I acquired a Baltimore department store, Hochschild Kohn, buying through a company called Diversified Retailing, that later merged with Berkshire. I bought at a substantial discount from book value, the people were first class, and the deal included some extras, unrecorded real estate values, and a significant LIFO inventory cushion. How could I miss? So, 3 years later, I was lucky to sell the business for about what I had paid. After ending our corporate marriage to Hochschild Kohn, I had memories like those of the husband in the country song, "My wife ran away with my best friend, and I still miss him a lot." I could give you other personal examples of bargain purchase folly, but I'm sure you get the picture. It's far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than a fair company at a wonderful price. Charlie Munger understood this early. I was a slow learner, but now, when buying companies or common stock, we look for first-class businesses accompanied by first-class managements. That leads right into a related lesson. Good jockeys will do well on good horses, but not on broken-down nags. Both Berkshire's textile business and Hochschild Kohn had able and honest people running them. The same managers employed in a business with good economic characteristics would have achieved fine records, but they were never going to make any progress while running in quicksand. I've said many times that when a management with a reputation for brilliance tackles a business with a reputation for bad economics, it is the reputation of the business that remains intact. I wish I hadn't been so energetic in creating examples. My behavior has matched that admitted by Mae West. I was Snow White, but I drifted. A further related lesson. Easy does it. After 25 years of buying and supervising a great variety of businesses, Charlie and I have not learned how to solve difficult business problems. What we have learned is to avoid them. To the extent we have been successful, it is because we concentrated on identifying 1-foot hurdles we could step over, rather than because we acquired any ability to clear 7-footers. The finding may seem unfair, but in both business and investments, it is usually far more profitable to simply stick with the easy and obvious than it is to resolve the difficult. On occasion, tough problems must be tackled, as was the case when we started our Sunday paper in Buffalo, thereby challenging an established competitor. In other instances, a great investment opportunity occurs when a marvelous business encounters a one-time huge but solvable problem, as was the case many years back at both American Express and Geico. Overall, however, we've done better by avoiding dragons than by slaying them. My most surprising discovery: the overwhelming importance in business of an unseen force that we might call the institutional imperative. In business school, I was given no hint of the imperative's existence, and I did not intuitively understand it when I entered the business world. I thought then that decent, intelligent, and experienced managers would automatically make rational business decisions, but I learned over time that isn't so. Instead, rationality frequently wilts when the institutional imperative comes into play. For example, 1. As if governed by Newton's first law of motion, an institution will resist any change in its current direction. 2. Just as work expands to fill available time, corporate projects or acquisitions will materialize to soak up available funds. 3. Any business craving of the leader, however foolish, will be quickly supported by detailed rate of return and strategic studies prepared by his troops. And 4. The behavior of peer companies, whether they are expanding, acquiring, setting compensation, or whatever, will be mindlessly imitated. Institutional dynamics, not venality or stupidity, set businesses on these courses which are too often misguided. After making some expensive mistakes because I ignored the power of the imperative, I have tried to organize and manage Berkshire in ways that minimize its influence. Furthermore, Charlie and I have attempted to concentrate our investments in companies that appear alert to the problem. After some other mistakes, I learned to go into business only with people whom I like, trust, and admire. As I noted before, this policy of itself will not ensure success. A second-class textile or department store company won't prosper simply because its managers are men that you would be pleased to see your daughter marry. However, an owner or investor can accomplish wonders if he manages to associate himself with such people in businesses that possess decent economic characteristics. Conversely, we do not wish to join with managers who lack admirable qualities, no matter how attractive the prospects of their business. We've never succeeded in making a good deal with a bad person. Some of my worst mistakes were not publicly visible. These were stock and business purchases whose virtues I understood and yet didn't make. It's no sin to miss a great opportunity outside one's area of competence, but I have passed on a couple of really big purchases that were served up to me on a platter and that I was fully capable of understanding. For Berkshire's shareholders, myself included, the cost of this thumb-sucking has been huge. Our consistently conservative financial policies may appear to have been a mistake, but in my view, were not. In retrospect, it is clear that significantly higher, though still conventional leverage ratios at Berkshire would have produced considerably better returns on equity than the 23.8% we have actually averaged. Even in 1965, perhaps we could have judged there to be a 99% probability that higher leverage would lead to nothing but good. Correspondingly, we might have seen only a 1% chance that some shock factor, external or internal, would cause a conventional debt ratio to produce a result falling somewhere between temporary anguish and default. We wouldn't have liked those 99-to-1 odds, and never will. A small chance of distress or disgrace cannot, in our view, be offset by a large chance of extra returns. If your actions are sensible, you are certain to get good results. In most such cases, leverage just moves things along faster. Charlie and I have never been in a big hurry. We enjoy the process far more than the proceeds, though we have learned to live with those also. We hope in another 25 years to report on the mistakes of the first 50. If we are around in 2015 to do that, you can count on this confession occupying many more pages than it does here.
From The Children of the Rich and Famous, September 10, 1990. Excerpts from an article by Alan Farnham.
Not spendthrifts, sots, nor simps, These billionaires and billionairesses are working hard, even though they don't have to. They're exotic, some neurotic. They're billionaire children, saplings bent by a green money wind. Some inheritors learn to use their wealth to good effect, like a tool. They escape the pitfalls of their class and lead full, productive lives, accomplishing what they have set out to do. How do they succeed? What motivates them? The reasons range from personal pride to a pining for adventure. Much depends on how they were raised. Telling children early and bluntly whether they will inherit makes for a good start. Warren Buffett's son, Howard, knows that Dad intends to use his Berkshire Hathaway lucre to curb population growth. Yet Howard, 35, has not wasted time complaining. He farms corn and soybeans just outside of Omaha, and in 1989, he was elected commissioner of Douglas County, Nebraska. Having to measure up to one's family name can be daunting. His famous dad is the reason Howard Buffett never had a lemonade stand as a kid. I felt discouraged from trying. It seemed nothing I could do would be as successful as what he did, and what I did might reflect badly on him. The shadow of the elder Buffett's success stretches across the imagination of his 6-year-old grandchild. Says Howard, little Howie owns 10 shares of Coke stock that he bought with money he saved. One day my wife was explaining that there's a first time for everything, and he said, I don't think there'll ever be a first time I can afford to buy a share of Berkshire Hathaway. All rich kids suffer from a form of discrimination that one calls wealthism. Howard Buffett is philosophical. There are jerks with money and jerks without. He regularly suffers from the public's assumption that anyone named Buffett must be rich. One night at a restaurant, he recalls, I pulled out my checkbook to pay the bill, and some guy says, Gee, I wish I had that checkbook. I didn't have the patience to tell him, No, buddy, you really don't. Though he tries to behave as if his father's wealth didn't exist. Doing so for very long is almost impossible. When I get back to the office this afternoon, there will be 9 messages, he says. 8 of them will be from someone wanting something from my dad. Howard Buffett says, There are certain things you need to do with kids whether you have money or not. My mom and dad taught me responsibility. Clean out the gutters and mow the lawn. When you do wrong, pay the consequences. Teaching his own son Howie how to live with privilege has not been easy. When basketball hero Michael Jordan visited Omaha, Howie wanted to sit at the head table with the other dignitaries. Howard Sr. had to explain to him that he wasn't automatically entitled to. Almost all billionaires' children really want to work. They understand that by starting a career or business they will increase their self-esteem and gain independence from their parents. But where parents are bankrolling the experiment, gains can prove ephemeral. Howard Buffett farms 406 acres and loves the work. I've been farming 9 years. It's a very independent form of activity. Everything's up to you. It teaches you a value system and gives you an instrument to achieve that. So far, so good. Except for one thing. Dad owns the land. I pay him a percentage of the gross income as rent. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but the rent is based upon my weight. I'm 5'8" and I weigh about 200 pounds. He thinks I weigh too much. That I should weigh 182.5. If I'm over, my weight is 26% of gross income. If I'm under, 22%. It's the Buffett family version of going to Weight Watchers. I don't mind it, really. He's showing he's concerned about my health. But what I do mind is that even at 22%, he's getting a bigger paycheck than almost anybody around. Somehow, he always manages to control the circumstances.
The Midas Touch at a Discount, November 5, 1990. By Edmund Faltermeyer.
Turbulence and trouble occasionally make for good bargains. Consider Berkshire Hathaway, akin to a juggernaut that unaccountably takes a backward step. Already stumbling before Saddam Hussein and recession worries cannonaded the market, the Omaha company's stock has fallen 36% this year to $5,550 a share, more than twice the descent of Standard & Poor's 500 stock index. For CEO Warren Buffett, 60, the investing wizard who owns 42% of the Berkshire stock, that translates into a paper loss of $1.5 billion, or $215,450 an hour. It also spells a buying opportunity for others. Says Michael Price, who runs the $3.1 billion mutual shares fund and is no investing slouch himself, it's a way for the defensive growth investor to be in stocks. Other money managers recommend the stock, including John Tilson, who runs the high-performing $63 million Pasadena Growth Fund for Roger Engelmann Associates. He's been buying Berkshire stock. Buffett himself displays no erosion of confidence, not even on the matter of his paper loss. Says he, "I have not cut back from double hamburgers to single hamburgers. How about the corporate jet dubbed the Indefensible? That'll be the last thing to go," he jokes. Buffett took over Berkshire Hathaway in 1965, and by the time the stock reached its peak in late 1989, it had advanced 741-fold from $12 a share to $8,900. But a down year is not a new experience for Buffett. Berkshire's stock fell 55% in 1974. A unique creature that leads 3 lives, the company is a property and casualty insurance company that doubles as Buffett's investing vehicle. It also owns a collection of manufacturing, publishing, and retailing operations. In 1989, these companies, which included the publisher of World Book Encyclopedia, collectively earned an astounding 57% on average equity. One possible explanation for this year's slide in Berkshire's stock price: some of its biggest holdings are in broadcasting, publishing, and insurance, industries whose shares have been especially hard hit in recent months. The Buffett name may also have lost some of its magic, which previously helped push the stock price to a lofty premium over book value per share. A few money managers carpet his so-called White Squire deals with Salomon Inc., Gillette, U.S. Air, and Champion International. In part to help these companies deter raiders, Buffett bought preferred stock that can be converted into big blocks of common. Portfolio manager John Neff of Vanguard's Windsor Fund says he sees some negatives there because the deals helped to insulate the management of each company. Buffett has said that Berkshire will ultimately achieve satisfactory returns on these preferreds, only if the company's common stocks do well. Says Pasadena's Tilson, "The market could be saying to Buffett, 'You've lost it, pal.' But I don't think so." Using a computer model, Tilson's firm calculated that Berkshire's stock recently sold for $510 less than its real worth. Because of the discount, reasons Tilson, you're buying Warren Buffett's abilities for nothing. For investors, that's an inviting price.
Buffett Buys Junk, April 22, 1991, by Jennifer Reese. Wall Street has long wondered if star investors would find bargains in the disarray of the junk bond market. Enter Warren Buffett. In the 1990 annual report of Berkshire Hathaway, the billionaire CEO discloses that Berkshire has put $440 million into RJR Nabisco's high-yield bonds. Buffett, who last year made an intensive study of the junk market, says in an interview, quote, "There was even more carnage than I'd thought." He concluded that the RJR bonds were a better value than anything else he saw in the field because the company is well run, and its credit better than commonly perceived. Buffett estimates that the market value of his RJR bonds is now some $175 million above his cost. Does he wish he'd bought more? He says, "There are a lot of things I wish I'd done in hindsight, but I don't think much of hindsight generally in terms of investment decisions. You only get paid for what you do." From Now Hear This, April 5, 1993. Warren E. Buffett, 62, billionaire CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, on why the cost of executive stock options should be reorganized on companies' income statements. Quote, "If options aren't a form of compensation, what are they? If compensation isn't an expense, what is it? And if expenses shouldn't go into the calculation of earnings, where in the world should they go?" Buffett and Coca-Cola. Almost 25 years ago, in 1988, the then president of Coca-Cola, Donald Keough, called his long-term friend and one-time Omaha neighbor, Warren Buffett, with a question. "Warren, the trading in Coke stock suggests that someone is buying a lot of it. Could that possibly be you?" Said Buffett, "Well, keep it quiet between you and Roberto, but yup, it's me." Keough, delighted, hung up to tell his boss, CEO Roberto Goizueta, while Buffett went back to buying. The market crash of 1987 had hammered Coke, and Buffett picked up huge amounts of the stock in 1988 and 1989, adhering to his own famous advice: be greedy when others are fearful. He finished his buying in 1994, having accumulated the nice round number of 400 million, split-adjusted, Coke shares. The position, which in 1994 gave Berkshire 7.8% ownership of Coke, cost nearly $1.3 billion, for an average of just under $3.25 a share. That was the start of a great relationship, overall. But Buffett, who served as a Coke director from 1989 until 2007, used his power on one occasion to unseat a Coke CEO and, on another, to kill a management decision he thought bad for the company. Here are 3 excerpts from Fortune articles, the first published in the salubrious early days of the Buffett-Coke relationship, the others during times of controversy. From The World's Best Brand, May 31, 1993. Excerpts from an article by John Huey.
Says Buffett, "If you run across one good idea for a business in your lifetime, you're lucky. And fundamentally, this is the best large business in the world. Its product sells for an extremely moderate price. It's universally liked. The per capita consumption goes up almost every year in almost every country. There isn't any other product like it." On Goizueta and Keough? If you have the 1927 Yankees, all you wish for is their immortality, Buffett says. As long as we have the kind of people who are focused as they are, I don't worry about the business. If you gave me $100 billion and said, take away the soft drink leadership of Coca-Cola in the world, I'd give it back to you and say, it can't be done.
Goizueta died in 1997. Keough retired, and the new CEO, Douglas Ivester, looked more like a bat boy at the plate than a Ruth or Gehrig. In early 2000, Fortune published an exclusive story whose opening paragraphs follow. From What Really Happened at Coke, January 10, 2000, by Betsy Morris and Patricia Sellers. First of all, let's clear up the mystery about why Doug Ivester, at age 52, and after only a little more than 2 years on the job, suddenly resigned as chairman and CEO of Coca-Cola. He was pushed. Hard. Sure, he was beleaguered by a string of setbacks in his short, unhappy tenure. But aides who worked with him every day, and who were as shocked as anyone when the dogged executive threw in the towel, report that everything was business as usual on the first day of December, a Wednesday, when Ivester flew from Atlanta to Chicago for a routine meeting with McDonald's executives. Upon his return, everything seemed to have changed. What hasn't come to light until now is that while Ivester was in Chicago, he attended another very private meeting, this one called by Koch's two most powerful directors, Warren Buffett and Herbert Allen. At that meeting, the two directors informed Ivester that they had lost confidence in his leadership. For most of the past year, Buffett had remained in the wings, while Allen had numerous conversations with Ivester about his cramped management style. This time it was different, according to well-placed sources close to the situation. Together, Buffett and Allen, the board's two 800-pound gorillas, told Ivester that they had reached an irreversible conclusion. He was no longer the man who should be running Koch. It was time for a change. The meeting was non-confrontational, even sympathetic, and it apparently ended without a conclusion as to the next step. Conceivably, Ivester could have decided to fight. But it's also conceivable that Buffett and Allen could have decided to force the issue, perhaps as early as the next board meeting, scheduled for 2 weeks later. Their leadership as directors is outsized, considering that Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, of which he owns 31%, controls about 200 million shares, or 8.1% of Koch, while Allen owns or controls about 9 million shares. Whatever they were all thinking when they left the meeting, Ivester returned to Atlanta and called an emergency board meeting for that Sunday, at which he quit. His announcement stunned executives, directors, employees, and Wall Street. Even the man who was named to replace him, Doug Daft, a 56-year-old Australian whose experience has mostly been running Koch's businesses in Asia. Daft came in believing that Koch needed to diversify into non-cola drinks. Months after taking over in early 2000, he championed a $15.7 billion merger with Quaker Oats, which owned Gatorade. The deal was to be done with Koch stock, and that ran into Buffett's strong conviction that using stock in a merger often causes the acquirer to give up more value than it gets. A 5-hour Koch board meeting followed, in which Buffett led the way in arguing against the deal. Here is my account of the Koch debate, part of a sidebar in a 2001 article. A sidebar from The Value Machine, February 19, 2001, by Carol Loomis. Buffett was a true gorilla, though by no means the only director opposed in persuading Koch to drop its plan to buy Quaker Oats. Buffett will hold his tongue in a board meeting if a proposal for discussion just nibbles at shareholder value. But if a monster bite is to be taken, he won't stay quiet. And in this case, he thought the price Koch was proposing to pay, all of it in stock, was just too much. The terms would have left Koch giving up more than 10% of its very valuable self for assets that, even assuming some synergies, did not strike Buffett as granting Koch shareholders an acceptable payoff, even over the long term. By the time Buffett got through presenting his argument, the plan to buy Quaker was effectively dead. Debating Buffett about price is not, for most people, a rewarding experience. He is simply too logical and smart to be sent to defeat. Under Daff and his successor as CEO, Neville Eisdell, Koch's growth stalled and its stock languished. The next CEO, Muhtar Kent, took over in 2008, just in time for the credit crisis. But he has presided over good growth in the last couple of years, and as of mid-2012, Coke stock was selling at $39 per share versus the all-time high of $41 set in the bubble year of 1998. Berkshire still owns all of its 400 million shares. Against their cost basis of about $1.3 billion, they were valued at $15.6 billion in mid-year 2012. Coke's repurchases of stock have raised Berkshire's holding to 8.9% of what Buffett still thinks, well, leaving aside Berkshire, is the best large business in the world. CL. The full text of the 3 Coke articles excerpted here is available at fortune.com/BuffettBook. How Buffett Views Risk, April 4, 1994. An excerpt from Buffett's letter to shareholders in the 1993 Berkshire Hathaway Annual Report.
The strategy we've adopted precludes our following standard diversification dogma. Many pundits would therefore say the standard must be riskier than that employed by more conventional investors. We disagree. We believe that a policy of portfolio concentration may well decrease risk if it raises, as it should, both the intensity with which an investor thinks about a business and the comfort level he must feel with its economic characteristics before buying into it. In stating this opinion, we define risk using dictionary terms as the possibility of loss or injury. Academics, however, like to define investment risk differently, averring that it is the relative volatility of a stock or a portfolio of stocks, that is, their volatility as compared to that of a large universe of stocks. Employing databases and statistical skills, these academics compute with precision the beta of a stock, its relative volatility in the past, and then build arcane capital investment and capital allocation theories around this calculation. In their hunger for a single statistic to measure risk, however, they forget a fundamental principle. It is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. For owners of a business, and that's the way we think of shareholders, the academic's definition of risk is far off the mark, so much so that it produces absurdities. For example, under beta-based theory, a stock that has dropped very sharply compared to the market, as had Washington Post when we bought it in 1973, becomes riskier at the lower price than it was at the higher price. Would that description have then made any sense to someone who was offered the entire company at a vastly reduced price? In fact, the true investor welcomes volatility, because a wildly fluctuating market means that irrationally low prices will periodically be attached to solid businesses. It is impossible to see how the availability of such prices can be thought of as increasing the hazards for an insurer who is totally free to either ignore the market or exploit its folly.
Buffett hits $200 billion downdraft. November 17, 1994. By Colin Leinster.
Quick, what's the fastest way to become a millionaire in the airline business? Answer: start with $1 billion. So goes a joke from Warren Buffett, who, by Fortune's estimate, is sitting on a paper loss of about $200 million on his $358 million investment in the embattled U.S. Air Group. But behind the scenes, Buffett is obviously talking tougher. U.S. Air's 1994 proxy contains what amounts to a warning. He and Charles Munger, vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett's company and investing arm, will quit as U.S. Air directors if the company doesn't win cost-cutting concessions from its union. U.S. Air has the highest costs among domestic carriers and aims to slice $1 billion out of its overhead, with $500 million coming from labor. Like other insiders, Buffett declines to comment on where U.S. Air is headed. But the September 8 crash near Pittsburgh, which killed 132 people, made a cloudy future even murkier. Observers at first hoped the disaster would encourage pilots, machinists, and flight attendants to agree to bigger cuts. But that optimism soon faded. Says Robert Flock, a spokesman for the Airline Pilots Association, "Every time before when the company has been in trouble, it has come to the pilots and then squandered what it got." Analyst John Pinkavage of the Transportation Group points out that money-losing, cash-strapped U.S. Air has no control over other big costs such as fuel prices. Says he, "There's not a lot of room for anything to go wrong. No barrier between U.S. Air and sailing into the sunset." U.S. Air spokeswoman Andrea Butler insists that anything like going into Chapter 11 is a last resort. Management is more focused on working out productive labor agreements. The airline may well have to add profit sharing and board representation to its current offer. Such sweeteners were part of how Northwest and TWA settled their union differences.
Editor's note: Buffett's misstep into U.S. Air in the early 1990s drew so much public attention, and no doubt produced so many chuckles, that many people think to this day that the investment was a painful loser for Berkshire. But in 1996, a new CEO, Stephen Wolfe, took over the company and engineered what Buffett described in Berkshire's 1997 annual report as a resuscitation bordering on the miraculous. U.S. Air's stock went from a low of $4 a share to $75 a share, and the conversion rights in Berkshire's U.S. Air convertible preferreds, therefore, shot up in value. Dividends on the preferred that had not been paid were made up and were also, because of their lateness, accompanied by compensatory payments. With the preferred to be called for redemption in 1998, Buffett said in the 1997 annual report, "It is now almost certain that our U.S. Airways share will produce a decent profit. That is, if my cost for Maalox is excluded, and the gain could even be indecent." The dollar gain was never reported, but much later in the 2007 annual report, Buffett called it hefty. He also noted what had happened in the intervening years to U.S. Air. The company went bankrupt twice. Buffett and Gates. We've put these two articles together because they appeared sequentially and have the shared virtue of dipping into the friendship, the surprising friendship, between Buffett and Bill Gates in its early days. What we have here, after all, is not only an age difference of 25 years, but also a yawning gap then, if less exclusively so now, between what the two were obsessively interested in: investments for Buffett and technology for Gates. In 1991, nonetheless, a mutual friend of the two titans, Meg Greenfield, editor of the Washington Post editorial page and a longtime friend of Gates's mother, Mary, brought them together. Greenfield, in fact, was intrigued by her idea. "I was not unaware," Greenfield told Fortune in the mid-1990s, "that this was an interesting pairing." The site of their meeting was the country home, outside Seattle, of Gates's parents, Mary and Bill Sr. Greenfield, who grew up in Seattle and kept a house there, brought her house guests: Buffett and Washington Post Company CEO Katharine Graham. They came to the gathering in Greenfield's ancient, cramped Subaru. Bill and his girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, Melinda French, arrived more grandly, in a helicopter. Bill hoped, even upon landing, to escape early. He hadn't wanted to come, but had given in to his mother's wishes that he be there. His view changed immediately as he began talking to Buffett. Their minds connected, as if each man had quickly realized that, for once, the playing field for brilliance had leveled out. That was the start of a close friendship that lasts to this day, and that, in particular, has gone on to create philanthropic history. Back to the nature of the two articles that follow. The first was a box within a long piece about Gates. The second piece, by Gates himself, is ostensibly his review of a new Buffett book by Roger Lowenstein. But more than half the article is simply Gates presenting, in a wide-ranging way, his impressions of Buffett. The second piece is also, to my knowledge, unique in Fortune's history, being probably the only article in our more than 80 years to have been first published in another business magazine, specifically Harvard Business Review. The article, nonetheless, seemed so interesting to Fortune's editors, one billionaire talking about the other, that we secured permission from Bill Gates to republish it verbatim. Thanks to the author once again. C.L. The Billionaire Buddies, January 16, 1995, by Brent Schlender.
Who says you can't put a value on friendship? When the pals are Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, the total comes to nearly $19 billion, give or take a few hundred million. For 4 years now, America's two richest men, at the moment Buffett is number one, have cultivated an intriguing cross-generational friendship in which their wealth is probably their biggest similarity. We're sort of the odd couple, aren't we, says Buffett, the chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, Inc., and self-professed technophobe. Buffett, 64, is the epitome of the industrial age investor, spinning billions from holdings in the most basic of businesses, companies that make things like shoes, soda pop, and razor blades. Gates, on the other hand, is the Midas of the information age, who made his billions selling pure thought stuff. The two were introduced by mutual friend Meg Greenfield, a Washington Post editorial page editor who, like Gates, is a native of Seattle. The billionaires avail each other of free advice from time to time. For years, Gates tried in vain to convince Buffett that he ought to at least think about buying a personal computer. Buffett finally bought one at the behest of another friend so he could play online bridge. Among his playing partners is Bill Gates' dad. And Buffett, who flies around the country in a used jet he calls the Indefensible, has offered Gates some sage advice about such corporate status symbols. Says Buffett, "I told him that I didn't get mine until I was 55, and that maybe he ought to save something for his old age, too." Buffett also helped Gates find a cut-rate deal on a diamond ring when he got engaged a couple of years ago. Gates cooked up a scheme to surprise his wife-to-be, Melinda French, with a trip to Omaha to pick out a ring at Borsheim's, the famous jewelry store owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Gates chuckles as he recalls, "Warren had them open the store on the Sunday especially for us. On the way there, he told me that when he first got engaged, he spent 6% of his net worth on the ring, and that as a sign of true loyalty, I should do the same for Melinda." The two occasionally tease each other about who is richer. Knowing that Gates is an inveterate gambler, Buffett once bought a pair of what he calls tricky dice to a get-together. Says Buffett, "I was trying to put him in second place permanently, but Bill immediately caught on, of course." Buffett also jokes that if I had known that it was Bill that I was bidding against for Leonardo da Vinci's notebook, I would have bid the price up even higher. What does Gates enjoy most about Buffett? The conversation. Says he, "Warren is so humble and yet so good at describing complicated things. At the surface level, it's funny for him to quote, say, Mae West when talking about his investment philosophy, but of course, he is really saying something much deeper. He's like that all the time, so I am always learning something about him."
Gates on Buffett, February 5, 1996, by Bill Gates.
Roger Lowenstein begins his biography of Warren Buffett with a disclaimer. He reveals that he is a long-time investor in Berkshire Hathaway, the company that under Buffett's guidance has seen its share price rise in 33 years from $7.60 to approximately $30,000. In reviewing Lowenstein's book, I must begin with a disclaimer, too. I can't be neutral or dispassionate about Warren Buffett because we're close friends. We recently vacationed together in China with our wives. I think his jokes are all funny. I think his dietary practices, lots of burgers and cokes, are excellent. In short, I'm a fan. It's easy to be a fan of Warren's, and doubtless many readers of Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist, Random House, 1995, will join the growing ranks. Lowenstein's book is a straightforward account of Buffett's remarkable life. It doesn't fully convey what a fun, humble, charming guy Warren is, but his uniqueness comes across. No one is likely to come away from it saying, "Oh, I'm like that guy." The broad outlines of Warren's career are well known, and the book offers enjoyable detail. Lowenstein traces Warren's life from his birth in Omaha in 1930 to his first stock purchase at age 11, and from his study of the securities profession under Columbia University's legendary Benjamin Graham to his founding of the Buffett Partnership at age 25. The author describes Buffett's secretiveness about the stocks he picked for the partnership and his contrasting openness about his guiding principle, which is to buy stocks at bargain basement prices and hold them patiently. As Warren once explained in a letter to his partners, this is the cornerstone of our investment philosophy. Never count on making a good sale. Have the purchase price be so attractive that even a mediocre sale gives good results. Lowenstein describes how Warren took control of Berkshire Hathaway and cash-cowed its dying textile business in order to purchase stock in other companies. The book traces how Berkshire evolved into a holding company and how its investment philosophy evolved as Warren learned to look beyond financial data and recognize the economic potential of unique franchises like dominant newspapers. Today, Berkshire owns companies such as See's Candies, the Buffalo News, and World Book, as well as major positions in companies such as American Express, Capital Cities ABC, about to be Disney, Coca-Cola, Gannett, Gillette, and the Washington Post Company. Readers are likely to come away from the book feeling better educated about investing in business, but whether those lessons will translate into great investment results is less than certain. Warren's gift is being able to think ahead of the crowd, and it requires more than taking his aphorisms to heart to accomplish that, although Warren is full of aphorisms well worth taking to heart. For example, Warren likes to say that there are no called strikes in investing. Strikes occur only when you swing and miss. When you're at bat, you shouldn't concern yourself with every pitch, nor should you regret good pitches that you don't swing at. In other words, you don't have to have an opinion about every stock or other investment opportunity, nor should you feel bad if a stock you didn't pick goes up dramatically. Warren says that in your lifetime, you should swing at only a couple dozen pitches, and he advises doing careful homework so that the few swings you do take are hits. His penchant for long-term investments is reflected in another aphorism. You should invest in a business that even a fool can run, because someday a fool will. He doesn't believe in businesses that rely on their success on every employee being excellent. Nor does he believe that great people help all that much when the fundamentals of a business are bad. He says that when good management is brought into a fundamentally bad business, it's the reputation of the business that remains intact. Warren installs strong managers in the companies Berkshire owns and tends to leave them pretty much alone. His basic proposition to managers is that to the degree that a company spins off cash, which good businesses do, the managers can trust Warren to invest it wisely. He doesn't encourage managers to diversify. Managers are expected to concentrate on businesses they know well, so that Warren is free to concentrate on what he does well: invest. My reaction upon meeting Warren took me by surprise. Whenever somebody says to me, "You've got to meet my friend so-and-so, he's the smartest guy ever," my defenses go up. Most people are quick to conclude that someone or something they encounter personally is exceptional. This is just human nature. Everybody wants to know someone or something superlative. As a result, people overestimate the merit of that to which they've been exposed. So the fact that people called Warren Buffett unique didn't impress me much. In fact, I was extremely skeptical when my mother suggested I take a day away from work to meet him on July 5th, 1991. What were he and I supposed to talk about? P/E ratios? I mean, spend all day with a guy who just picks stocks? Especially when there's lots of work to do. Are you kidding? I said to my mom, "I am working on July 5th. We're really busy. I am sorry." She said, "Kay Graham will be there." Now, that caught my attention. I had never met Graham, but I was impressed with how well she had run the Washington Post Company and by her newspaper's role in political history. As it happened, Kay and Warren had been great friends for years, and one of Warren's shrewdest investments was in Post stock. Kay, Warren, and a couple of prominent journalists happened to be in the Seattle area together, and owing to an unusual circumstance, they all squeezed into a little car that morning for a long drive to my family's weekend home, which is a couple of hours outside the city. Some of the people in the car were as skeptical as I was. "We're going to spend the whole day at these people's house?" someone in the cramped car asked. "What are we going to do all day?" My mom was really hardcore that had come. "I'll stay a couple of hours and then I'm going back," I told her. When I arrived, Warren and I began talking about how the newspaper business was being changed by the arrival of retailers who did less advertising. Then he started asking me about IBM. If you were building IBM from scratch, how would it look different? What are the growth businesses for IBM? What has changed for them? He asked good questions and told educational stories. There's nothing I like so much as learning, and I had never met anyone who thought about business in such a clear way. On that first day, he introduced me to an intriguing analytic exercise that he does. He'll choose a year, say 1970, and examine the 10 highest market capitalization companies from around then. Then he'll go forward to 1990 and look at how those companies fared. His enthusiasm for the exercise was contagious. I stayed the whole day, and before he drove off with his friends, I even agreed to fly out to Nebraska to watch a football game with him. When you are with Warren, you can tell how much he loves his work. It comes across in many ways. When he explains stuff, it's never, "Hey, I'm smart about this and I'm going to impress you." It's more like, "This is so interesting and it's actually very simple. I'll just explain it to you and you'll realize how dumb it was that it took me a long time to figure it out." And when he shares it with you, using his keen sense of humor to help make the point, it does seem simple. Warren and I have the most fun when we're talking about the same data that everybody has and coming up with new ways of looking at them that are both novel and, in a sense, obvious. Each of us tries to do this all the time for our respective companies, but it's particularly enjoyable and stimulating to discuss these insights with each other. We are quite candid and not at all adversarial. Our business interests don't overlap much, although his printed World Book Encyclopedia competes with my electronic Microsoft Encarta. Warren stays away from technology companies because he likes investments in which he can predict winners a decade in advance, an almost impossible feat when it comes to technology. Unfortunately for Warren, the world of technology knows no boundaries. Over time, most business assets will be affected by technology's broad reach, although Gillette, Coca-Cola, and See's should be safe. One area in which we do joust now and then is mathematics. Once, Warren presented me with 4 unusual dice, each with a unique combination of numbers, from 0 to 12, on its sides. He proposed that we each choose one of the dice, discard the third and fourth, and wager on who would roll the highest number most often. He graciously offered to let me choose first, and then he said, "Okay, because you get to pick first, what kind of odds would you give me?" I knew something was up. "Let me look at those dice," I said. After studying the numbers on their faces for a moment, I said, "This is a losing proposition. You choose first." Once he chose a die, it took me a couple of minutes to figure out which of the 3 remaining dice to choose in response. Because of the careful selection of the numbers on each die, they were non-transitive. Each of the 4 dice could be beaten by one of the others. Die A would tend to beat die B, die B would tend to beat C, die C would tend to beat D, and die D would tend to beat die A. This meant that there was no winning first choice of a die, only a winning second choice. It was counterintuitive, like a lot of things in the business world. Warren is great with numbers, and I love math too. But being good with numbers doesn't necessarily correlate with being a good investor. Warren doesn't outperform other investors because he competes odds better. That's not it at all. Warren never makes an investment where the difference between doing it and not doing it relies on the second digit of computation. He doesn't invest, take a swing of the bat, unless the opportunity appears unbelievably good. One habit of Warren's that I admire is that he keeps his schedule free of meetings. He's good at saying no to things. He knows what he likes to do, and what he does unbelievably well. He likes to sit in his office and read and think. There are a few things he'll do beyond that, but not many. One point that Lowenstein makes that is absolutely true is that Warren is a creature of habit. He grew up in Omaha, and he wants to stay in Omaha. He has gotten to know a certain set of people, and he'd like to spend time with those people. He's not a person who seeks out exotic new things. Warren, who just turned 65, still lives in the Omaha house he bought for himself at age 25. His affinity for routine extends to his investment practices, too. Warren sticks to companies that he is comfortable with. He doesn't do much investing outside the U.S. There are a few companies that he has decided are great long-term investments. And, despite the self-evident mathematics that there must be a price that fully anticipates all the good work that those companies will do in the future, he just won't sell their stock no matter what the price is. I think his reluctance to sell is more philosophical than optimization-driven, but who am I to second-guess the world's most successful investor? Warren's reluctance to sell fits in with his other tendencies. Warren and I share certain values. We both feel lucky that we were born into an era in which our skills have turned out to be so remunerative. Had we been born in a different time, our skills might not have had much value. Since we don't plan on spending much of what we have accumulated, we can make sure our wealth benefits society. In a sense, we're both working for charity. In any case, our heirs will get only a small portion of what we accumulate, because we both believe that passing on huge wealth to children isn't in their or society's interests. Warren likes to say that he wants to give his children enough money for them to do anything, but not enough for them to do nothing. I thought about this before I met Warren, and hearing him articulate it crystallized my feelings. Lowenstein is a good collector of facts, and Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist, is competently written. Warren has told me that the book is in most respects accurate. He says he's going to write his own book someday, but given how much he loves to work and how hard it is to write a book, based on my own personal experience, I think it will be a number of years before he does it. When it comes out, I'm sure it will be one of the most valuable business books ever. Already, Warren's letters to shareholders in the Berkshire Hathaway annual reports are among the best of business literature. Much of Lowenstein's analysis comes from those letters, as it should. If, after reading Buffett, you're intrigued by the man and his methods, I strongly commend you to the annual reports, even ones from 10 or 15 years ago. They're available in many libraries. Other books have been written about Warren Buffett and his investment strategy, but until Warren writes his own book, this is the one to read.
From Untangling the Derivatives Mess, March 20th, 1995. An excerpt from an article by Carol Loomis. Here are the last 2 paragraphs of this article. Given the range of complications that derivatives present, outside directors cannot possibly achieve close communion with the contacts their companies hold. Most chief executives won't master the game either. In the end, the choice of what risks to hedge, what derivatives to employ in doing so, and how to draw the bright line between risk management and speculation will be largely left to financial people down the corridor, some of whom, recent train wrecks notwithstanding, may think of themselves as running a profit center. And on the other end of their phones will be derivative salespeople trying to sell the latest innovation, which assuredly will not be a plain vanilla hedge. It's not a particularly cheerful picture, not for a problem as big as derivatives. So maybe what we need is new thinking, a fresh approach, a suggestion so radical it goes off the page. Here's one. Warren E. Buffett, chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, says he'd deal with derivatives by requiring every CEO to affirm in his annual report that he understands each derivatives contract his company has entered into. Says Buffett, put that in, and I suspect you'll fix up just about every problem that exists. In a market that seems to thrive on complexity and obfuscation, such a solution won't happen. It's too simple. But he's right. 2 items from Now Hear This, April 3, 1995. Warren E. Buffett, 64, chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, which sells its candy, shoes, and other products at the annual meeting. Though we'd like to think of the meeting as a spiritual experience, we must remember that even the saintliest of religions includes the ritual of the collection plate. May 29, 1995. Charles T. Munger, 71, vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway, referred to litigation involving the company. They subpoenaed our staffing papers. Not only didn't we have any staffing papers, we didn't have any staff. From Why Warren Buffett's Betting Big on American Express, October 30th, 1995. Excerpts and a sidebar from an article by Linda Grant. When Buffett is accumulating a stock, he doesn't want it known. When the news gets out, usually because of an SEC filing, and Buffett figures he still might buy more of the stock, he won't say much about why he likes it. That was the case with American Express in 1995. The business press, including Fortune, was calling, but Buffett wasn't talking. So we wrote our story anyway, even flagging it on the cover with a title more skeptical than the inside title above. The cover read, Why is Warren Buffett betting billions on this house of cards? The reality is that the Fortune writer and editors working on this story didn't like Amex's prospects at all, but had to deal with the annoying fact that Buffett apparently did. Our approach to this problem was to write a long article beginning and ending with Buffett, and also including a sidebar about him, but that otherwise dealt at length with the difficulties facing Harvey Golub, the company's new CEO. Golub had come from consulting firm McKinsey. Fortune took the view that a consultant's talents, cost-cutting, and selling divisions, in particular, might not be ideal for restoring the prestige that Amex had lost in the early 1990s. Here is what Fortune had to say about Buffett in several paragraphs and the sidebar, At the end, we will report what he eventually had to say about the subject himself. C.L. The story's beginning. Warren Buffett loves to tell a parable about the stock market's irrationality. It was 1963, and a scandal involving fake inventories of salad oil at a small subsidiary of American Express drove down the price of Amex shares. How bad a problem was this? To find out, Buffett spent an evening with the cashier at Ross's Steakhouse in Omaha, seeing if people would stop using their green cards. The scandal didn't seem to give any of the diners indigestion, so Buffett seized the opportunity to buy 5% of the company for $13 million. He later sold his holding for a $20 million profit. Now Buffett hopes to relive the story, with much larger numbers. Over the past few years, the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway has accumulated more than 49 million shares of American Express at a 10.1% stake. Its value, about $2.2 billion, makes it one of Buffett's largest investments, along with Coca-Cola, Gillette, and Capital Cities ABC. Once again, he thinks Wall Street is irrationally down on Amex stock. The trouble this time is not salad oil, but a long and well-publicized catalog of strife. A nearly dysfunctional management team, led by James Robinson III, damaged the brand in the early 1990s. His grand strategy to build a financial supermarket fell like a house of cards, with Amex's Shearson Lehman brokerage subsidiary eating up $4 billion in capital before being sold last year. More recently, the tarnished American Express card has been losing market share to Visa and MasterCard as Amex's principal consumer benefit, Prestige, becomes a tougher sell. The company's international business, say analysts, is in the doldrums. Always the patient investor, Buffett, worth $14.2 billion at last count, believes the latest troubles are little more than a distraction. What he likes is exactly what has made him rich before: a mighty brand coupled with a healthy cash flow. After all, American Express, according to London marketing group Interbrand, is still one of the 10 most recognized brands in the world. Buffett believes the name remains synonymous with financial integrity and money substitutes around the world. As he explained to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders at last spring's annual meeting, quote, "By far the most important factor in Amex's future for a great many years to come will be the credit card. We think American Express's management thinks well about how to keep the card special." Buffett probably isn't particularly concerned about the company's loss of market share. More likely, he's gambling that Amex, even if it fails to grow dramatically, will become a very profitable niche player in the card market. But if American Express is to fulfill Buffett's expectations, it will have to breathe new life into its brand. No easy task. At the story's end. No matter how tough the challenges that lie ahead for Amex, it's rarely wise to bet against Warren Buffett. After all, he has wagered on strong brands like Coke and Gillette and made a bundle. He also invested successfully in auto insurer Geico, which, like Amex, has a strong cash flow. When Buffett comes up aces, it's usually because he's backing a strong management hand. What's hard to see this time around is how a bunch of consultants can rake in the pot in a truly cutthroat game. How Buffett Rated Amex a Buy, October 30th, 1995. A sidebar by Linda Grant. Just about everyone knows that Warren Buffett is a zealous disciple of value investing, the approach championed by Wall Street legend Benjamin Graham in the 1930s and 1940s. Value investors buy stocks only when they believe the market is temporarily and irrationally valuing a company at far below what they call its intrinsic value. But many are mystified by Buffett's purchase of roughly $2 billion of American Express shares. Wall Street has shunned the stock in recent years as Amex began losing market share and suffered from problems at its former brokerage subsidiary, Shearson Lehman. But maybe it's all the bad news that attracted Buffett in the first place. After all, a primary Graham tenet is to think for yourself and understand the difference between price and value. He also counseled followers to rake the market for bargains. Value investor Robert G. Hagstrom, Jr., author of The Warren Buffett Way and portfolio manager of Philadelphia's Focus Trust, points out that to understand any Buffett investment, investors must start with his philosophy, stated in his 1989 letter to shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway. Buffett wrote that the value of any business today is, quote, calculated by taking all future cash flows, in and out, and discounting them at prevailing interest rates. So valued, all businesses, from manufacturers of buggy whips to operators of cellular phones, become economic equals. In other words, Hagstrom believes that Buffett determines a stock's value as if it were a bond. He starts with net owner earnings, which is reported earnings plus depreciation and amortization minus capital investments. For Amex, this was $1.4 billion last year, the same amount the company reported as its earnings, although that's not always the case. Then, he asks, if Amex were a bond with annual coupons of $1.4 billion, how much would the coupon grow? And what would the bond be worth 10 years out? It's difficult to determine a company's coupon, says Hagstrom, because you have to make best guess estimates about a rate of growth. This is a very basic financial theory, but of course the secret is in the doing. So far, no one has cracked the Buffett valuation code, but Hagstrom has tried. His model calculates Amex's intrinsic value per share at $86.77. The spread between $86.77 and Amex's recent market price of about $44 represents a margin of safety. It is a big buffer, says Hagstrom, that will protect investors even if Amex loses money in a bad year. Liking the equation, Hagstrom himself decided to buy some 8,000 Amex shares for his own account. All that is what Fortune had to say in its October 30th, 1995 issue about Buffett and American Express. And when Buffett finally began talking about the subject himself, that was not until his 1997 annual shareholder letter. Did he also lay out a set of deeply analytical reasons as to why he had bought Amex stock? Absolutely not. Instead, he admitted getting a tip on the golf course. The background of the tip is that in 1991, Berkshire had bought $300 million worth of American Express perks, a security that was essentially a common stock, and that in its first 3 years featured a trade-off. Specifically, Berkshire got extra dividend payments in those years, but was also capped in the price appreciation it could realize. In August 1994, the perks were due to convert into common, and earlier that summer, Buffett was trying to decide whether to keep Amex stock or sell. The facts pushed him in two directions. Buffett wrote in his 1997 letter he thought Amex CEO Harvey Golub was outstanding and would realize the company's full potential. He was worried, though, about the relentless competition that Amex was getting from other card companies, especially Visa. Weighing the arguments, Buffett said, I leaned toward sale. But then he played golf one 1994 day in Prouts Neck, Maine, with Frank Olson, CEO of Hertz. Wrote Buffett in his letter, Frank is a brilliant manager with intimate knowledge of the card business. So from the first tee on, I was quizzing him about the industry. By the time we reached the second green, Frank had convinced me that Amex's corporate card was a terrific franchise, and I had decided not to sell. On the back nine, I turned buyer, and in a few months, Berkshire owned 10% of the company. Since the end of 1994, a midway point in Buffett's buying of American Express, Berkshire had realized, through mid-2012, an average annual compounded total return of about 13%. Included in that calculation is the value, at the distribution date, of a company that Amex spun off in 2005, Ameriprise. The distribution was treated as a special Amex dividend, which, like all dividends, went into the calculation of total return. At mid-2012, Berkshire's Amex stock had a cost basis of $1.3 billion and a market value of $8.8 billion. Nice, but that is not to say Berkshire has lacked for drama while holding Amex. Between July 2007 and March 2009, as financial stocks got shellacked, Amex dropped from $65 a share to $10 before it began to climb back. Naturally, Buffett just patiently watched. As this book went to press, Amex stock was $59. Amex has meanwhile bought in large quantities of its own stock, to the degree that Berkshire now owns 13% of the company. CL. The full text of why Buffett's betting big on American Express is available at fortune.com/BuffettBook. Gift That Gives. A Bit o' Buffett, March 18, 1996, by Bethany McLean. The $32,800 price tag on Berkshire Hathaway has thwarted both owners who wanted to give, even one share would trigger gift taxes, and little outsiders who wanted to own Warren Buffett's hot stock. On May 6, shareholders will vote on Buffett's plan to sell at least $100 million of new Class B shares for a mere $1,000 or so each. Current shares, to be renamed Class A, can convert to Bs at any time. Quote, "We just want to attract those who are attracted to us," Buffett says. To deter a slew of converts, he advises that the Bs are, quote, "a tiny bit inferior to the existing A's. They have fewer voting rights and lack the A's input on corporate donations. But for gift givers and little guys, these baby Bs buy you real Buffett." The Bill and Warren Show, July 20th, 1998. Edited by Brent Schendler. This was Bill Gates and Warren Buffett on a University of Washington stage, lecturing, so to speak, but mostly doing it by answering questions. For an introduction, I will simply reprint, with small edits, the excellent Brent Schendler paragraphs with which Fortune led off this historic duopoly event. CL. The queue of students stretched through the lobby and out the door of the University of Washington's Husky Union Building in Seattle on a balmy Friday afternoon in late May. You could tell by the abundance of pressed chinos and dress shirts, and the shortage of nose rings, that this wasn't the ticket line for a Fish concert. Instead, the well-groomed group was staking out prime seats for, of all things, a lecture, albeit a very special lecture. The students and a few lucky guests were to be treated to a rare public dialogue between the two richest businessmen in the solar system, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. The billionaire buddies conceived the event to coincide with Buffett's weekend visit to the Gates' home, following Microsoft's annual summit meeting for CEOs. The super investor and the cyber tycoon asked some 350 business school students to participate in the session and invited the public broadcasting system and Fortune to document the affair. While the students milled downstairs, Gates and Buffett bantered with their wives and a small group of friends that included, among others, Katharine Graham, the former CEO of the Washington Post Company, and Bill's dad and sister. They noshed on fresh fruit in a makeshift green room while a makeup artist powdered Bill's nose and trimmed Warren's unruly eyebrows, much to Susie Buffett's amusement. At one point, the Oracle of Omaha entertained the group with a goofy imitation of Richard Nixon's V for Victory sign. As showtime approached, the two gamely posed for photos and traded barbs like old college roomies. The other guest's main concern was that the Titans not be too long-winded, so everyone could get back to Gates's house in time to play bridge. It felt like a convivial family reunion. Granted, of one very high-powered family. For a guest in that green room, perhaps the most lasting impression was the cross-generational affection between America's best-known billionaires. For the record, on that day, the 42-year-old Gates' net worth hovered around $48 billion, compared with Buffett's $36 billion. Buffett, who only a few years ago was considerably richer than Gates, has managed to remain 25 years older, though. Buffett's presence seemed to calm Gates, who acted loose and gregarious despite Microsoft's legal fisticuffs with federal trust busters and the stress of hosting several dozen prominent CEOs for the previous 2 days. Although Bill has finally begun to look his age, nascent crow's feet now crease the corner of his eyes, and he's no longer the beanpole he was. The Buffetts and Graham still dote on him like a wunderkind. He, in turn, treats them with a warm hint of deference, quite a contrast to his usual debater's demeanor. Finally, the two made their way to the stage, pausing in the wings for University of Washington Business School Dean Bill Bradford's introduction. Unfortunately, the dean's remarks, which mainly praised Microsoft for hiring University of Washington students, missed the point. The funny, philosophical, extraordinary conversation that followed would be much more than a pep talk from a local employer and his pal. See for yourself. Brent Schendler. What do you get when you put a billionaire buddy act in front of 350 students? 84 billion of inspiration. In a meeting of incomparable minds and unspendable net worth. Buffett and Gates muse about taking risks, motivating employees, confronting mistakes, and giving back. The result? Something pretty darn close to wisdom.
1. How we got here. Warren and Bill explain how they became richer than God. Buffett. I thought I ought to start this off by announcing that Bill and I have a small bet as to who would get the most applause. I suggested that I bet my house against his. We settled on a small sum, but evidently it isn't such a small sum to Bill, because just before we came out, he gave me this Nebraska Cornhusker shirt to wear, and then he puts on this purple University of Washington shirt himself. They've asked us to start out talking, the two of us, about what got us here, but then it's on to your questions. How I got here is pretty simple in my case. It's not IQ, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. The big thing is rationality. I always look at IQ and talent as representing the horsepower of the motor, but that the output, the efficiency at which that motor works, depends on rationality. A lot of people start out with 400 horsepower motors, but only get 100 horsepower of output. It's way better to have a 200 horsepower motor and get it all into output. So, why do smart people do things that interfere with getting the output they're entitled to? It gets into the habits and character and temperament and behaving in a rational manner, not getting in your own way. As I said, everybody here has the ability absolutely to do anything I do and much beyond. Some of you will, and some of you won't. For the ones who won't, it will be because you get in your own way, not because the world doesn't allow you. So I have one little suggestion for you. Pick out the person you admire the most, and then write down why you admire them. You're not to name yourself in this. And then put down the person that, frankly, you can stand the least, and write down the qualities that turn you off in that person. The qualities of the one you admire are traits that you, with a little practice, can make your own, and that, if practiced, will become habit-forming. The chains of habit are too light to be felt until they are too heavy to be broken. At my age, I can't change any of my habits. I'm stuck. But you will have the habits 20 years from now that you decide to put into practice today. So I suggest that you look at the behavior that you admire in others and make those your own habits. And look at what you really find reprehensible in others and decide that those are the things you are not going to do. If you do that, you'll find that you convert all of your horsepower into output. Gates. I think Warren's absolutely right about habit. I was lucky enough when I was young to have an exposure to computers, which were very expensive and kind of limited in what they could do, but still they were fascinating. Some friends of mine and I talked about that a lot and decided that because of the miracle of chip technology, they would change into something that everybody could use. We didn't see any limit to the computer's potential, and we really thought writing software was a neat thing. So we hired our friends who wrote software to see what kind of a tool this could really be, a tool for the information age that could magnify your brain power instead of just your muscle power. By pursuing that with a pretty incredible focus, and by being there at the very beginning of the industry, we were able to build a company that has played a very central role in what's been a pretty big revolution. Now, fortunately, the revolution is still at the beginning. It was 23 years ago when we started the company, but there's no doubt that if we take the habits we formed and stick with them, the next 23 years should give us a lot more potential, and maybe even get us pretty close to our original vision: a computer on every desk and in every home. I was wondering how you define success personally. Buffett. I can certainly define happiness because happy is what I am. I get to do what I like to do every single day of the year. I get to do it with people I like, and I don't have to associate with anybody who causes my stomach to churn. I tap dance to work, and when I get there, I think I'm supposed to lie on my back and paint the ceiling. It's tremendous fun. The only thing in my job that I don't like, and this just happens every 3 or 4 years, is that occasionally I have to fire somebody. They say success is getting what you want, and happiness is wanting what you get. I don't know which one applies in this case, but I do know I wouldn't be doing anything else. I'd advise you that when you go out to work for an organization of people you admire, because it will turn you on. I always worry about people who say, I'm going to do this for 10 years. I really don't like it very well, and then I'll do this. That's a little like saving up sex for your old age. Not a very good idea. I have turned down business deals that were otherwise decent deals because I didn't like the people I would have to work with. I didn't see any sense in pretending. To get involved with people who cause your stomach to churn, I'd say it's a lot like marrying for money. It's probably a bad idea under any circumstances, but it's absolutely crazy if you're already rich, right? Gates. I agree that the key point is that you've got to enjoy what you do every day. For me, that's working with very smart people, and it's working on new problems. Every time we think, hey, we've had a little bit of success, we're pretty careful not to dwell on it too much because the bar gets raised. We've always got customer feedback telling us that the machines are too complicated and they're not natural enough. The competition, the technology breakthroughs, and their research make the computer industry, and in particular software, the most exciting field there is. And I think I have the best job in that business. Buffett. Don't you think Dairy Queen is more important than that? Berkshire Hathaway bought International Dairy Queen last fall for $585 million. Gates. You can manage Dairy Queen, Warren. I'll go and buy the dilly bars. Buffett. We'll raise the price when you come. Starting a new company is very risky. How do you determine when is the best opportunity to start a new company? Gates. When I started Microsoft, I was so excited that I didn't think of it as being all that risky. It's true, I might have gone bankrupt, but I had a set of skills that were highly employable, and my parents were still willing to let me go back to Harvard and finish my education if I wanted to. Buffett. You've always got a job with me, Bill. Gates. The thing that was scary to me was when I started hiring my friends, and they expected to be paid. And then we had customers that went bankrupt, customers that I counted on to come through. And so I soon came up with this incredibly conservative approach that I wanted to have enough money in the bank to pay a year's worth of payroll, even if we didn't get any payments coming in. I've been almost true to that the whole time. We've had about $10 billion now, which is pretty much enough for the next year. Anyway, if you're going to start a company, it takes so much energy that you'd better overcome your feeling of risk. Also, I don't think that you should necessarily start a company at the beginning of your career. There's a lot to be said for working for a company and learning how they do things first. In our case, Paul Allen and I were afraid somebody else might get there before us. It turned out we probably could have waited another year, in fact, because things were a little slow to start out. But being on the ground floor seemed very important to us. How did you get people to support you? Gates. At first, you'll run into some skepticism. If you're young, it's hard to go lease premises. You couldn't rent a car when you were under 25, so I was always taking taxis to go see customers. When people would ask me to go have discussions in the bar, well, I couldn't go to the bar. That's fun because when people are first skeptical, they say, "Oh, this kid doesn't know anything." But when you show them you've really got a good product and you know something, they actually tend to go overboard. So at least in this country, our youth was a huge asset for us once we reached a certain threshold. 2. The world is our oyster. Why Warren is sure everyone in China will want to drink Coke. How do you as businessmen take the companies global? Buffett. At Berkshire Hathaway, we don't take our businesses global directly. Our two largest commitments are Coke and Gillette. Coke has 80% of its earnings coming from abroad, and Gillette has 2/3 of its earnings coming from abroad. So they are participating in a worldwide improvement in living standards, and we go global by piggybacking on them. I can sit in Omaha and let Doug Ivester, CEO of Coca-Cola, fly all over the world. Gates. Our business is truly global. The PC standard is a global standard. What you need on a spreadsheet in Korea or Egypt is about the same as what you need in the U.S. We have to do some adaptation for the local languages, and that's a fun part of our business. Understanding bidirectional languages and the large alphabets that you have in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. In fact, our market share is much higher outside the U.S. than it is inside, because it's relatively hard to set up local subsidiaries and to understand local conditions, local distribution, and relationships. Since most of our competitors are from the U.S. and aren't as good at doing international business, we thrive even better in these other countries. Most of our growth will come from outside the U.S. Here, it will get to the point where it is largely a replacement market. Now, that doesn't mean U.S. customers don't want better software that can see, listen, and learn. But outside the U.S., we still have that early growth slope phenomenon. What impelled you to make a trip together to China in 1995, and how has that trip affected your global business decisions since? Gates. We went to China for a lot of reasons. Partly to relax and have fun. We found a few McDonald's there so we didn't feel too far away from home. It was also exciting to go and see all the changes taking place, to see different parts of the country, and to meet some of the leaders. China is a market that Microsoft had already been investing in. We've upped that a lot since. As a percentage of our sales, though, it's tiny, well under 1%. And so even though it will double every year for the next 5 years, it's really only by taking a 10-year view that we can say it's worth the emphasis we're putting on it. Although about 3 million computers get sold every year in China, people don't pay for the software. Someday they will, though. And as long as they are going to steal it, we want them to steal ours. They'll get sort of addicted, and then we'll somehow figure out how to collect sometime in the next decade. Buffett. My family was amazed that I went. I never traveled beyond the outer reaches of the county in Nebraska. I had a terrific time, and also confirmed my feeling that there's going to be a lot of Coca-Cola sold there in the future. I told everyone over there that it acts as an aphrodisiac. 3. Innovations are us. Warren ponders Internet chewing gum. Both of you are innovators in your given industries. I was wondering what your definition of innovation is. Buffett. I don't do a lot of innovating in my work. I really have just 2 functions. One is to allocate capital, which I enjoy doing. And the second one is to help 15 or 20 senior managers keep a group of people enthused about what they do when they have no financial need whatsoever to do it. At least 3/4 of the managers that we have are rich beyond any possible financial need, and therefore my job is to help my senior people keep them interested enough to want to jump out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning and work with all of the enthusiasm they did when they were poor and starting. If I do those 2 things, they do the innovation. Gates. The technology business has a lot of twists and turns. Probably the reason it's such a fun business is that no company gets to rest on its laurels. IBM was more dominant than any company will ever be in technology, and yet they missed a few turns in the road. That makes you wake up every day thinking, let's try to make sure today's not the day we miss the turn in the road. Let's find out what's going on in speech recognition or in artificial intelligence. Let's make sure we're hiring the kinds of people who can pull those things together, and let's make sure we don't get surprised. Sometimes we do get taken by surprise. For example, when the Internet came along, we had it as a 5th or 6th priority. It wasn't like somebody told me about it and I said, "Oh, I don't know how to spell that." I said, "Yeah, I've got that on my list, so I'm okay." But there came a point when we realized it was happening faster and was a much deeper phenomenon that had been recognized in our strategy. So as an act of leadership, I had to create a sense of crisis, and we spent a couple of months throwing ideas and email around, and we went on some retreats. Eventually, a new strategy coalesced, and we said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to measure ourselves internally, and here's what the world should think about what we're going to do. That kind of crisis is going to come up every 3 or 4 years. You have to listen carefully to all the smart people in the company. That's why a company like ours has to attract a lot of people who think in different ways. It has to allow a lot of dissension, and then it has to recognize the right ideas and put some real energy behind them. What countries and companies are best prepared to take advantage of the information age that is revolutionizing society? Buffett. When you think about it, 15 years ago, this country almost had an inferiority complex about its ability to compete in the world. Gates. Everybody was talking about how the Japanese had taken over consumer electronics, and that the computer industry was going to be next, and that their system of hard work somehow was superior, and that we had to completely rethink what we were doing. Now, if you look at what's happened in personal computers, or in business in general, or at how we allocate capital, and how we let labor move around, the U.S. has emerged in a very strong position. So the first beneficiary of all this information technology has been the U.S. In places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Scandinavian countries, people are adopting the technology at basically the same rate that we are. And there are a few countries that, relative to their level of income, are going after the technology at an even higher rate than we are because they believe so much in education. In Korea and in many parts of China, we see incredible penetration of personal computers even at very low income levels because people there have decided it's a tool to help their kids get ahead. The whole world is going to benefit in a big way. There will be this shift where instead of your income level being determined by what country you are from, it will be determined by your education level. Today, a PhD in India doesn't make nearly as much as a PhD in the US. When we get the internet allowing services and advice to be transported as efficiently as goods are transported via shipping, then you'll get essentially open market bidding for that engineer in India versus an engineer here in the US. And that benefits everyone because you're taking better advantage of those resources. So the developed countries will get the early benefit of these things, but in the long run, the people in developing countries who are lucky enough to get a good education should get absolutely the biggest boost from all of this. Buffett. I didn't grasp it at first, but it's huge. The technological revolution will change the world in dramatic ways and quickly. Ironically, however, our approach to dealing with that is just the opposite of Bill's. I look for businesses in which I think I can predict what they're going to look like in 10 or 15 or 20 years. That means businesses that will look more or less as they do today, except that they'll be larger and doing more business internationally. So I focus on an absence of change. When I look at the internet, for example, I try and figure out how an industry or company can be hurt or changed by it, and then I avoid it. That doesn't mean I don't think there's a lot of money to be made from that change. I just don't think I'm the one to make a lot of money out of it. Take Wrigley's chewing gum. I don't think the internet is going to change how people are going to chew gum. Bill probably does. I don't think it's going to change the fact that Coke will be the drink of preference and will gain in per capita consumption around the world. I don't think it will change whether people shave or how they shave. So we are looking for the very predictable, and you won't find the very predictable in what Bill does. As a member of society, I applaud what he's doing, but as an investor, I keep a wary eye on it. Gates. This is an area where I agree strongly with Warren. I think the multiples of technology stocks should be quite a bit lower than the multiples of stocks like Coke and Gillette, because we are subject to complete changes in the rules. I know very well that in the next 10 years, if Microsoft is still a leader, we will have had to weather at least 3 crises. 4. See you in court. Bill and Warren talk about tangling with trustbusters. What is the appropriate role for antitrust law in American business? Buffett. We had one civil antitrust case at the Buffalo Evening News in 1977, and, believe it or not, in the Salomon situation in 1991. In addition to having problems with the Federal Reserve in New York, and the SEC, and the U.S. Treasury, and the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. We also had the Department of Justice Antitrust Division after us. I don't know what happened to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They missed us for some reason. Those are the only 2 experiences I had, and in neither case did I feel that we had done anything wrong. I might add that there was never any adjudication against us either time. I am no antitrust scholar. I met Bill 8 years ago, and he's a terrific teacher. He spent 6 or 7 hours explaining Microsoft to me. Here I am, the world's biggest dummy on technology, and he explained it to me pretty darn well. When he got through with it, I bought 100 shares of stock so I could keep track of it. That shows 2 things. One is that I've got an IQ of about 50, and the second is that I don't think he had any monopoly. Gates. The key role of competition law is to protect consumers and to make sure that new products get created and that those products are very innovative. And you can look at different sectors of the economy and ask, where is that happening very well? No matter how you score it, there's no doubt that one sector of economy would stand out as absolutely the best, and that's the personal computer industry. I don't say the computer industry at large because you have to remember that before personal computers came along, the structure was very different. People were stuck. Once you bought a computer from Digital or IBM or Hewlett-Packard or anyone else, the software that you created only ran on that computer. The vision of Microsoft is that all of these computers would work the same. The reason for that is that if you want to get a lot of great software, you have to have a lot of computers out there, millions and millions of them. So you've got to make them cheap and make them so you don't have to test the software on all the different ones. The goal of the PC industry was to have every company competing to make the most portable one, or the fastest one, or the cheapest one. That would be great for consumers, and it would spark a big software market. The price of computing before the PC came along was going down at a certain rate, and since the PC came along, it's gone down at an incredible rate. The variety and quality of software has also increased at a phenomenal rate. We're absolutely at the peak of that today. The number of new software companies being started, the number of new jobs being created, the level of investment, the number of companies going public, you name it. It's way beyond what it was 3 years ago. So consumers are doing very well. Part of the PC dynamic is that instead of asking software developers to duplicate one another's work, we take anything that's typical in all those applications and put those features in Windows. So for things like connecting to the internet, instead of somebody having to do that themselves, we put that in. That's been the evolution. Graphical user interfaces came in, hard disk support, networking support, now internet support, including the browser. I think antitrust laws as written are fine. There are people who will debate whether they should be weaker, but that's of academic interest. When I come in to do business, I'm very careful to check with our lawyers to be sure we're steering 100 miles away from anything that would be questionable. So it is somewhat of a surprise to find ourselves in an antitrust controversy. Thank goodness for the judiciary, which is an environment in which facts are tested and people can see if competition worked in a way it should and has been beneficial to consumers. There's no doubt in our minds where that is going to come out. In the meantime, we're going to be the focus of a lot of controversy because the filing of a lawsuit is a very big deal. You've got the government taking on that challenge and saying a lot of righteous things, and that's just something we'll have to be sure doesn't distract us from what we're really all about. 5. What's a company really worth? Warren explains why Berkshire stock costs more than a Lexus. Mr. Buffett, I was told that you have a policy against splitting stock, and I wondered if you might comment on Microsoft's history of splitting stock. Buffett, I've never really felt that if I went into a restaurant and said, I want 2 hat checks instead of 1 for my hat, I'd really be a lot better off. But I also don't like having any quarrel with companies that do split their stock, and I don't think Microsoft's been hurt by it. I think that our policy fits us very well. There's nothing in my religious upbringing that causes me to recoil from stock splits. I'm on the boards of 3 companies, 2 of which have split their stock in the last couple of years. I happen to think that by not splitting Berkshire stock, we attract a slightly more long-term oriented group of investors. What you want to do is to attract shareholders that are very much like you, with the same time horizons and expectations. We don't talk about quarterly earnings, we don't have an investor relations department, and we don't have conference calls with Wall Street analysts because we don't want people who are focusing on what's going to happen next quarter or even next year. We want people to join us because they want to be with us until they die. If I were to split the stock dramatically, would I change that shareholder composition much? No, but I'd change it just a little. And remember, all the shareholder seats are filled, just like this auditorium. If I say something that offends all of you and you all leave, and another group comes in, am I better off or worse off? Well, that depends upon what they're like and what you're like. But I think I already have a very good group of shareholders who are attracted to these policies, and I think this policy reinforces it slightly. Gates. Warren has done something admirable by signaling to people that it's a different stock, and that they ought to think of Berkshire Hathaway as being a little different from your typical company. Having that unusual stock price is probably a good thing, as long as the newspaper doesn't screw it up. He's caused a lot of problems, with the widths of those columns in the stock tables. Mr. Buffett, what's your response to those who say that traditional methods for valuing companies are obsolete in this market? Buffett. I think it's hard to find companies that meet our tests of being undervalued in this market, but I don't think that the methods of valuation have changed. It's just that in some markets, like in the mid-1970s, every security you looked at was really dramatically undervalued. I once ran an investment partnership for about 13 years, ending in 1969, and I closed it up because I couldn't find anything. I hadn't lost the ability to value companies, there just wasn't any left that were cheap enough, and I wasn't in the business of shorting stocks. But I think that there's no magic to evaluating any financial asset. A financial asset means, by definition, that you lay out money now to get money back in the future. If every financial asset were valued properly, they would all sell at a price that reflected all of the cash that would be received from them forever until Judgment Day, discounted back to the present at the same interest rate. There wouldn't be any risk premium because you'd know what coupons were printed on this bond between now and eternity. That method of valuation is exactly what should be used whether you're in 1974 or you're in 1998. If I can't do that, then I don't buy, so I'll wait. Would you look for a higher price-to-earnings ratio at this point than you did in 1969? Buffett. That ratio would be affected by interest rates. The difference between now and 1969 or any other time, in terms of calculating a valuation, wouldn't be affected by anything else. Now, if you looked at the overall market, returns on equity are much higher than they were in 1969 or 1974 or any other time in history. So if you're going to say you're going to value the overall market, the question becomes, do you crank in the present 20% returns on equity for American business in aggregate and say that's a realistic figure to stick on for this future that runs out until eternity? I'd say that's a fairly reckless assumption and doesn't leave much margin for safety, and I would say that present market levels discount a lot of that. So that makes me quite cautious. Do you feel that technology has made businesses more efficient to the point that you can pay more for them? Gates. There is definitely a one-time lift when you start using technology, and particularly if U.S. companies are using it better than their competitors outside the U.S. You get the ability to communicate better, and you get global scale in a lot of businesses that wouldn't have had it before. When you look at the really big earners, the ones generating this 20% return on equity and going to that worldwide marketplace, companies like Coca-Cola or Microsoft or Boeing or GE, I know that every one of those has been helped by technology, but that cannot explain why 10 years from now they'd be getting that kind of return on equity. Almost certainly there's something ephemeral about current conditions. Buffett. I'm sure technology has made companies more efficient, and if I thought otherwise, I'd be afraid to say so with Bill sitting right here beside me. But the question you might ponder is this. Let's just say that I found a way to clone Jack Welch and ran off 499 clones of him. Jack continued to run General Electric, and these other 499 ran the rest of the Fortune 500. Is the Fortune 500 going to have a higher return on equity 5 years from now or not? I don't think the answer to that is easy, because if you get 500 Jack Welches out there, they are going to be doing things in a competitive way that may well produce lower returns for American businesses than if you've got a bunch of clods out there and a guy like Jack competing with them. If you've got great variation in the quality of management, it improves the chances enormously of a relatively significant number getting terrific returns. So I would say that a lot of things in business, including technology, really have the same effect as if you went to a parade and the band started coming down the street, and all of a sudden you stood up on tiptoe. In another 30 seconds, everybody else is up on tiptoe, and it would be hell on your legs, and you still wouldn't be seeing any better. Capitalism tends to be self-neutralizing like that, in terms of improvements. That's marvelous because it means we have better everything than otherwise, but the real trick is to stand up on tiptoe and not have anyone notice you. The recent wave of mergers has been staggering. Could you comment on how any of these mergers will create value for shareholders? Buffett. Actually, the two of us have a small announcement we'd like to make. Laughter. It won't stop. Mergers will be motivated by very good considerations. There truly are synergies in a great many mergers, but whether there are synergies or not, they are going to keep happening. You don't get to be the CEO of a big company by being a milquetoast. You are not devoid of animal spirits, and it gets contagious. I've been a director of 19 different public companies over the years, and I can tell you that the conversation turns to acquisitions and mergers much more when the competitors of the particular company are engaging in those. As long as our economy works the way it does, and I think it works very well, you're going to see a lot of it. A generally buoyant market tends to encourage mergers because everybody's currency is more useful in those circumstances. A few weeks later, Berkshire Hathaway agreed to pay $23.5 billion in stock to acquire General Re, the world's third largest reinsurance company. Gates. I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism, but General Motors was created out of a restructuring of the automobile industry for specialized orientation to companies that did the whole job, and anybody who missed that was basically wiped out. We've bought a lot of small companies, and I'd say that's been vital to us. These are companies that on their own probably wouldn't have made it, but when their abilities are combined with ours, both of us were able to create a much better set of products than we could have otherwise. I think in banking today, if you're a medium-sized bank, you're probably going to need to participate in all this stuff that's going on. It doesn't make that much sense to have so many banks in this country, and so there will be certain ones going after scale. But there are a lot of silly mergers, too. At the end of the day, is the shareholder better off after a merger? Buffett. In most acquisitions, it's better to be the target than the acquirer. The acquirer pays for the fact that he gets to haul back to his cave the carcass of the conquered animal. I am suspicious of people who just keep acquiring almost by the week, though. If you look at the outstanding companies, say a Microsoft or an Intel or a Walmart, their growth overwhelmingly has been internal. Frequently, if some company is on a real acquisition binge, they feel they're using funny money, and it has certain aspects of a chain letter game. Beyond that, I'd like to see a period where merged companies just run by themselves after a deal, rather than moving around the accounting and putting up big restructuring charges. I get suspicious when there's too much activity. I like to see organic growth. 6. Aw shucks. Warren and Bill muse on their mistakes, their business partners, and managerial succession. What was the best business decision you made? Buffett. It was just jumping in the pool, basically. The nice thing about the investment business is that you don't need very many deals to succeed. In fact, if when you got out of business school here, you got a punch card with 20 punches on it, and every time you made an investment decision, you used up one punch, and that's all you were going to get, you would make 20 very good investment decisions, and you could get very rich, incidentally. You don't need 50 good ideas at all. I hope the one I made yesterday was a good one, but they've always been kind of simple and obvious to me. The truth is, you know them when you see them. They're so cheap. When I got out of Columbia University, I went through the Moody's manuals page by page. The industrial manual, the transportation manual, the banks and finance manual, just looking for things. And I found stocks at 1 times earnings. One was Genesee Valley Gas, a little tiny company up in upstate New York, a public utility selling at 1 times earnings. There were no brokerage reports on it, no nothing. But all you had to do was turn the page. It worked out so well I actually went through the book a second time. Bill was reading the World Book at the time. He's since put it out of business. Gates. We were talking at breakfast this morning about which of all Warren's investment decisions was the worst one. They're tough to find because his track record is unbelievable. But we decided that, by some metric, buying the one that his company is named after, Berkshire Hathaway, was probably his worst investment decision. Buffett. That's true. We went into a terrible business because it was cheap. It's what I refer to as the used cigar butt approach to investing. You see the cigar butt down there? It's soggy and terrible, but there's one puff left, and it's free. That's what Berkshire was when we bought it. It was selling below working capital. But it was a terrible, terrible mistake. I have made all kinds of bad decisions that have cost us billions of dollars. They've been mistakes of omission rather than commission. I don't worry about not buying Microsoft, though, because I didn't understand that business, and I didn't understand Intel. But there are businesses that I did understand. Fannie Mae was one that was within my circle of competence. I made a decision to buy it, and I just didn't execute. We would have made many billions of dollars, but we didn't do it. Conventional accounting doesn't record that, but believe me, it happened. Gates. In my case, I'd have to say my best business decisions have had to do with picking people. Deciding to go into business with Paul Allen is probably at the top of the list, and subsequently hiring a friend, Steve Ballmer, who has been my primary business partner ever since. It's important to have someone who you totally trust, who is totally committed, who shares your vision, and yet who has a little bit different set of skills, and who also acts as something of a check on you. Some of the ideas you run by him, you know he's going to say, "Hey, wait a minute, have you thought about this and that?" The benefit of sparking off somebody who's got that kind of brilliance is that it not only makes business more fun, but it really leads to a lot of success. Buffett. I've had a partner like that, Charlie Munger, for a lot of years, and it does for me exactly what Bill is talking about. You have to calibrate with Charlie, though, because Charlie says everything I do is dumb. If he says it's really dumb, I know it is. But if he just says it's dumb, I take that as an affirmative vote. It seems that in both of your companies, your success is driven by yourselves and your leadership skills. What will happen when you're gone? Buffett. Your assumption is wrong. I will keep working until about 5 years after I die, and I've given the directors a Ouija board so they can keep in touch. But if the Ouija board doesn't work, We have outstanding people who can do what I do. People are not going to stop drinking Coca-Cola if I die tonight. They're not going to quit shaving tonight. They're not going to eat less C's candy or fewer dilly bars or anything of the sort. Those companies have terrific products. They've got outstanding managers, and all you need at the top of Berkshire is someone who can allocate capital and make sure you have the right managers down below. We've got the people identified to do that, and the board of directors of Berkshire knows who they are. In fact, I've already sent out a letter that tells what should be done. And I've got another letter that's addressed that will go out at the time, and it starts out, "Yesterday I died," and then tells what the plans of the company are. Gates. My attitude is a lot like Warren's. I want to keep doing what I'm doing for a long, long time. I think probably a decade from now or so, even though I'll still be totally involved with Microsoft because it's my career, I will pick somebody else to be CEO. Buffett. I see some hands in the audience here. Gates. That's a long time hence, and our top managers are always sitting down and talking about succession in general, because we want to make sure that we're giving people the opportunity to move up. We don't want to ever create a situation where they feel like it's clogged and they have to go off somewhere else to get big challenges. Our growth helps a lot. We're able to spawn off very, very big jobs for people. Picking that next person is something I give a lot of thought to. But it's probably 5 years before I have to do something very concrete about it. If there was a surprise, well, there's a contingency plan. 7. Charity begins when I'm ready. Bill and Warren explain why they'll give away 99% of their wealth someday. As two of the world's most successful business people, what role do you see for yourselves in giving back to your communities? And how do you use your influence to get others to give back as well? Buffett. We both have a similar philosophy on that. I know in my own case that 99% plus will go back to society, just because we've been treated extraordinarily well by society. I'm lucky. I don't run very fast, but I'm wired in a particular way that I thrive in a big capitalist economy with a lot of action. I'm not adapted for football. I'm not adapted for violin playing. I happen to be in something that pays off huge in this society. As Bill says, if I had been born some time ago, I would have been some animal's lunch. I do not believe in the divine right of the womb. Frankly, I don't think it's right that the quarterback of the Nebraska football team next year should be the eldest son of the quarterback of the Nebraska football team of 22 years ago. Nor do I think that our Olympic team in 2000 should be chosen from the same family that was on the Olympic team in the various respective sports in 1976. We believe in a meritocracy when it comes to athletics and all sorts of things. Now, why not have a meritocracy in terms of what you go out into the world with in terms of the productive goods? Let the resources flow to those who use them best, and then I believe they should give them back to society when they get through. Gates. That's a great philosophy, not to mention that passing along a lot of money can be bad for the people who receive it. Buffett. You better not put it to a vote. How do you use your role as successful businessmen in influencing others, even those who are not as successful, to give back? Buffett. Let me suggest another way to think about this. Let's say that it was 24 hours before you were born, and a genie appeared and said, "You look like a winner. I have enormous confidence in you. And what I'm going to do is let you set the rules of the society into which you will be born. You can set the economic rules and the social rules. And whatever rules you set will apply during your lifetime and your children's lifetimes." And you'll say, "Well, that's nice, but what's the catch?" And the genie says, "Here's the catch. You don't know if you're going to be born rich or poor, white or black, male or female, able-bodied or infirm, intelligent or retarded. So all you know is that you're going to get one ball out of a barrel with, say, 5.8 billion balls in it. You're going to participate in what I call the ovarian lottery. It's the most important thing that will happen to you in your life, but you have no control over it. It's going to determine far more than your grades at school or anything else that happens to you. Now, what rules do you want to have? I'm not going to tell you the rules, and nobody will tell you. You have to make them up for yourself. But they will affect how you think about what you do in your will and things of that sort. That's because you're going to want to have a system that turns out more and more goods and services. You've got a great quantity of people out there, and you want them to live pretty well, and you want your kids to live better than you did, and you want your grandchildren to live better than your kids. You're going to want a system that keeps Bill Gates and Andy Grove and Jack Welch working long, long after they don't need to work. You're going to want the most able people working more than 12 hours a day. So you've got to have a system that gives them an incentive to turn out the goods and services. But you're also going to want a system that takes care of the bad balls, the ones that aren't lucky. If you have a system that is turning out enough goods and services, you can take care of them. You don't want people worrying about being sick in their old age or fearful about going home at night. You want a system where people are free of fear to some extent. So you'll try to design something, assuming you have the goods and services, to solve that sort of thing. You'll want equality of opportunity, namely a good public school system, to make you feel that every piece of talent out there will get the same shot at contributing. And your tax system will follow from your reasoning on that. And what you do with the money you make is another thing to think about. As you work through that, everybody comes up with something a little different. I just suggest you play that little game. How do you see yourselves as leaders in facets of human experience other than business? Gates. You have to be careful if you're good at something to make sure you don't think you're good at other things that you aren't necessarily so good at. I come in every day and work with a great team of people who are trying to figure out how to make good software, listening to the feedback and doing the research. And it's very typical that because I've been very successful at that, people come in and expect that I have wisdom about topics that I don't. I do think there are some ways that we've run the company, the way we've hired people and created an environment and used stock options, that would be good lessons for other businesses as well. But I always want to be careful not to suggest that we've found the solutions to all problems. Buffett. You can learn a lot by studying Microsoft and Bill, and you can learn the most by studying what it is he does year after year. But if he devoted 5% or 10% to what he's doing now, and then spread the remainder of his attention over a bunch of other things, well, society would be worse off, in my view. Bill's right. Occasionally there are things, like campaign finance reform, that he may want to take a position on. But you still don't want to say that the whole world ought to follow you on it. I'm very suspect of the person who is very good at one business. It also could be a good athlete or a good entertainer who starts thinking they should tell the world how to behave on everything. For us to think that just because we made a lot of money, we're going to be better at giving advice on every subject, well, that's just crazy.
Editor's note. Having fielded their last question, the two billionaires briefly acknowledged the applause and bolted off the stage, leaving behind an audience that clearly would have relished another 2 hours of them. But no, they had a bridge game to play. C.L. A House Built on Sand, October 26, 1998, by Carol Loomis. Of all the feats that Bill Gates has pulled off, one of the most remarkable is having persuaded Warren Buffett to go on vacations. Since Buffett regards his office in Omaha as the most pleasurable place to be in the world, being anywhere else does not intuitively appeal to him. Even so, Bill and Melinda Gates got him and his first wife, the late Susie Buffett, to come along for 2 weeks in China in 1996 and nearly 2 weeks in Alaska and U.S. Western parks in 1998. Unfortunately for Buffett, his August departure for Alaska that year coincided with his decision just hours before to try to buy the huge, trouble-fraught trading portfolio held by the collapsing hedge fund Long-Term Capital Management, LTCM. This story chronicles how that firm, under John Merriweather, floundered and how Buffett, operating at times from the fjords of Alaska, did not succeed in doing the deal. Instead, a consortium of 14 banks reluctantly put up $3.6 billion to keep LTCM afloat because they feared that the firm's bankruptcy would lead to unbearable losses in their own trading positions. An oversight group established by the banks set about unwinding LTCM's huge 60,000 positions, working, ironically, with Merriweather and partners, who had insistently negotiated a place for themselves in the picture. By the end of 1999, the oversight group managed to return the $3.6 billion put up by the banks, and in 2000, LTCM was liquidated. Just how the deal would have worked out for Buffett, had he instead bought that portfolio of 60,000 positions, is unknowable because there is no way of telling how his bidding group, which included Goldman Sachs, would have fared in dismantling the portfolio. Asked recently to reflect on his LTCM experience, Buffett says it still astounds him that the firm's managers, celebrated for their brilliance, let themselves get into a position in which they could lose all their money. Behavior of that kind is not socially acceptable at Berkshire, where there is a counter-reminder. You only need to get rich once. Apparently, having never quite absorbed that message, Merriweather has since the LTCM debacle been working, none too successfully, on a second effort to get rich, in the same business yet. In 1999, he started hedge fund JWM Partners, which made money for years, grew to about $3 billion in size, and then suffered huge losses in the credit crisis. The fund liquidated in 2008. The following year, Merriweather opened JM Advisors Management, whose investment record has not been publicly disclosed. CL. It is a curiosity of the long-term capital debacle that, although it has been endlessly and ably explained in the newspapers, it remains a mystery to many readers. Indeed, the affair has so many facets and is so complicated that it almost confounds complete understanding. For that reason, Fortune does not claim that this story will tell you all you need to know about long-term capital or give more than a glimpse of all that is surely yet to unfold. But we do know we understand, to an extent that no other publication can, the role played in this affair by noted investor Warren Buffett, who is a longtime friend of this writer. Buffett's role in this saga was important, dramatic, and not without humor, coming to a climax in 4 particular September days. Moreover, his role is possibly not ended. The outlines of what happened to long-term capital in September are among the few clarities of this affair. For most of the month, the huge hedge fund hung on the edge of bankruptcy and was finally saved only by a $3.6 billion infusion from a consortium of 14 banks and brokerage firms, all creditors who feared what the bankruptcy of a fund that owed upwards of $100 billion would do to their finances. Very much in the act, also, was the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which wished to avert the domino effects that a fast liquidation of the fund's holdings might have exerted on an already reeling global securities market. So the New York Fed played godfather to the rescue deal, bringing the creditors together at its own offices and overseeing their negotiations. In the center of this affair always, was the hedge fund's founder and principal manager, former Salomon Brothers whiz John Meriwether. Meriwether had surrounded himself with brilliant colleagues, many of them PhDs in mathematics and finance, and put them to work devising computer-driven trading strategies that were supposedly bulletproof. In the Greenwich, Connecticut office of the hedge fund's management firm, Long-Term Capital Management, there may be more IQ points per square foot than in any other institution extant. There are certainly more Nobel Prize winners per square foot. LTCM has two, Myron Scholes and Robert Merton, who less than a year ago went jubilantly to Sweden to receive the world's highest accolade for achievement in economics. The disaster that befell this brain trust recalls the first line of Allen Ginsberg's beatnik poem, Howl. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. At LTCM, the best minds were destroyed by the oldest and most famously addictive drug in finance, leverage. Had the fund not grievously overextended itself, it might still be trucking along, doing its thing, working those brain cells. But now, its strategists have swapped their laurels for the booby prize of the financial markets, which is the ignominy of being largely wiped out and viewed as bumbling losers. All of which raises the question of why Warren Buffett would want to pick up this particular piece of roadkill, and yet he made a stab at doing exactly that. His move came on Wednesday, September 23rd. It interrupted days of meetings that the New York Fed had been holding with the banks and brokerage firms that long-term capital owed huge amounts of money to, which were being asked, in their own self-interest, to put up new money to stave off the fund's bankruptcy. The participants were an extraordinarily powerful group. Every bank and firm that attended had sent its CEO or another top honcho, and the atmosphere was contentious. None of the members really wanted to ante up the money, and yet they dreaded a bankruptcy. As the creditors' group was about to reconvene on this Wednesday morning, William McDonough, president of the New York Fed, learned from Goldman Sachs, itself one of long-term capital's creditors, that it had an alternative financing proposition to present. McDonough recessed the meeting and listened to Goldman make the case for a bid, headed by Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, to take over the fund. The terms were complicated. More on that later. But essentially, the Buffett Group proposed to put up $4 billion and make itself the manager of long-term capital. Of the $4 billion, $3 billion was to come from Berkshire, $700 million from insurer American International Group, and $300 million from Goldman Sachs. This bid then went to Meriwether, and that's when it began to die. There is disagreement as to why. Buffett believes that the deal did not happen because Meriwether and the other LTCM principals simply did not want to accept his terms, which would have left LTCM's principals with little money and no jobs. For their part, Meriwether and other LTCM partners told McDonough that the Buffett bid was structurally flawed and therefore not feasible. Buying that argument, McDonough reconvened the meeting and told the creditors, in effect, that they were back to being the only game in town. One of the CEOs there told Fortune recently that McDonough explained that the other deal was not going to happen because it had structural problems. Grudgingly, the CEOs went back to negotiating their rescue plan, with each participant ultimately putting up very big money, $100 million to $350 million. Suppose, Fortune asked that same CEO, that McDonough had said the deal would not happen because long-term capital did not like its terms. I think, answered the CEO, that I would probably have told Meriwether to go screw himself. Of course, he adds, negotiations might then have turned into a game of chicken. Perhaps Merriweather would have countered that he preferred bankruptcy to Buffett. Then the creditors would be back to the question of whether they could stand bankruptcy. Squawk, squawk. Which side flinches first? To understand how both long-term capital and the creditors, and the Fed, to boot, got themselves into this amazing bind, and why Buffett volunteered to step into apparent chaos, it is necessary to look at the character of this hedge fund and its boss, John Merriweather. Until August 1991, Merriweather, now 51, was a vice chairman of Salomon, with responsibility for fixed income trading and also proprietary trading, which is a firm's investment of its own money. Merriweather was a huge moneymaker for the firm and was liked and admired to the point of reverence by the people who worked for him. Quote, British Guiana actually comes to mind, said a former Salomon Brothers executive recently. John had a kind of cult-like following. Then came Salomon's treasury bond scandal, precipitated by Paul Moser, one of Merriweather's senior people. In the chain of disclosure, Moser admitted to Merriweather in April 1991 that he had falsified bids for Treasury securities. Merriweather immediately went to his bosses, John Gutfreund and Thomas Strauss, with the news everybody concluded that the Fed must be told, and then nobody did the telling. When the scandal finally erupted in August, Moser was fired, and Gutfreund and Strauss resigned under pressure. To the rescue came Buffett, head of Salomon's biggest shareholder, Berkshire. In the first 2 days of Buffett's regime as chairman of Salomon, Merriweather's fate was uncertain. Many of Salomon's managing partners had turned against him and wanted him out. But Buffett was not sure that it was fair to fire Merriweather, since he had acted responsibly in immediately disclosing Moser's sins to the firm's bosses. In the end, Merriweather himself made the decision to resign, telling Buffett that he thought it was the best thing for the firm. Gradually, a number of men who had worked for Merriweather left Salomon to join him in business. The specifics about what they were to do surfaced in 1993, when Merriweather announced plans to start a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital. Actually, Long-Term Capital is made up of a variety of investment vehicles, some partnerships, some corporations, some domiciled in the U.S., some in the Cayman Islands. Why the Caymans? So that offshore investors, as well as certain kinds of U.S. investors, can avoid U.S. income taxes. A point that grates, of course, when we recall that the Fed was scrambling around in September on the fund's behalf. However, all of these instruments feed their money into a master fund called Long-Term Capital Portfolio LP, a Cayman partnership. It is this fund that has taken the positions that its investment managers, Merriweather and crew, dictated. From its beginning, the fund was distinctive in that its managers proposed to carry out trading strategies that would take time, 6 months to 2 years or more, to deliver profits. For that reason, LTCM ruled that it would not allow investors in the fund to withdraw their money quarterly or annually, which are the common practices of hedge funds, but would instead lock up their money until the end of 1997. As for the strategies, the fund's managers proposed to make relatively few trades that carried directional risk and instead to concentrate on capturing small profits from carefully hedged positions, particularly in the fixed income markets. A couple of illustrations will illuminate some distinctions in risk which are important in this tale. Imagine that an individual investor decided to buy the stock of Cendant on the theory that it was headed up. That would be a directional trade or a position risk. Assuming the investor didn't buy on margin, the percentage gain or loss on each dollar at risk would be exactly equal to the percentage rise or fall in Cendant stock. Long-term capital's main strategy, in contrast, was to make hedged trades that it thought would succeed regardless of the general trend of the markets. The fund put its financial technology and brains to work, for example, at identifying sectors of the market in which yields had gotten out of line with yields in related sectors. It would then buy one of the securities and short the other. A trade of this type can deliver a profit regardless of whether interest rates in general go up or down or stay flat. All that matters is that the two yields eventually converge. In this kind of trading, the fund never expected to earn a large return on each dollar at risk. An investor in long-term capital recalls talking by phone to some of its top managers in 1996 and asking them just how much they were annually realizing per dollar. The answer was 67 basis points, or 0.67 of a cent. Returns like that were never going to make investors happy unless the invested capital could be greatly enlarged, and that's where the leverage came in. Confident that its position was very low, the fund took on a colossal amount of what's called balance sheet risk, piling a huge slab of debt on top of its relative sliver of capital. At the moment in 1996, when that investor was getting his answer of 67 basis points, the fund had a ratio of $30 in balance sheet debt for every dollar in capital, leveraged 30 to 1. A 0.67% return on each dollar at risk produces a healthy 20% return on capital. Leverage that steep sounds terrifying, and eventually it was. But LTCM always maintained that its financial technologies and its meticulously constructed hedges gave the fund a conservative risk profile. In October 1994, LTCM spelled out this proposition in a paper sent to its investors. In the paper was a table that delineated a range of returns that the fund might aim for in a year and pair them with the probabilities of loss if things went bad. For example, the table said that if the fund were shooting for a 25% return, which was indeed a typical goal for the operation, the probability that it actually would end up losing 20% or more was an insignificant 1 in 100. The table never even contemplated a steeper loss. That would all be funny if it weren't tragic. In the first 8 months of 1998, the fund lost nearly 50% of its capital, and in September it hemorrhaged still more, with the loss going to around 90%. What this tells you, says Warren Buffett, is that underneath the mathematical elegance, underneath all those betas and sigmas, there is quicksand. At least one of long-term capital's investors was troubled by the same thought. The investor who told about the fund's 67 base point return wrote himself 2 notes for the file after that conversation. He recently showed them to Fortune. One note said, quote, "Are they no different from any Wall Street firm, Baer or Solomon or Goldman? It's the proprietary desks, without the people, overhead, or agency business." The second note leaned on a Yiddish word, kishka, which figuratively means gut instincts. Said the note, "There is no kishka override over the portfolio. One gets a Nobel Prize-winning computer system. Will that collapse one day? Would one prefer a person with kishkas at the control?" From the looks of the fund's vitality in its first 4 years, from the late winter of 1994 until the spring of 1998, not many investors were worrying about kishkas. The structure of long-term capital calls for its investors to pay the management company unusually steep fees. First, an annual 2% on the capital that an investor has in the fund, and second, 25% of profits earned. Even so, the fund's investors earned 20% in the 10 months of 1994 that it was in operation, 43% in 1995, 41% in 1996, and 17% in 1997. Furthermore, monthly performance figures showed that the fund was having a smooth ride, experiencing very little volatility in its results. Like a siren song, these facts brought in a flood of new money. That was true even though the fund's managers kept a tight veil of secrecy over their specific trading strategies, leaving their investors with little clue as to just how the fund was making its profits. By the fall of 1997, the combination of contributions and reinvested earnings had raised the capital of the fund to around $7 billion. At that point, things took an unexpected turn. LTCM itself concluded that the fund had too much capital for the investment opportunities open to it and forced many of its investors, notably those who had come in late, to withdraw their money. Many of those expelled went kicking and screaming, and at least one protested so angrily that LTCM allowed him to stay on board. The anger arose in part because LTCM's principals and other insiders were allowed to maintain their full stakes in the fund. In other words, maybe attractive investments weren't so scarce after all. When the smoke had cleared, at the end of 1997, the fund had $4.7 billion in capital, of which about $1.5 billion belonged to insiders. At that time, the fund also had about $125 billion in debt, which means that its balance sheet leverage ratio was about 25 to 1. But that far understates the true exposure, since the fund has always aggressively entered into off-balance sheet derivatives contracts that by their nature create additional leverage. Only an insider would know, at any point, what the derivatives exposure amounted to. But be assured that if the balance sheet leverage at year-end 1997 was 25 to 1, the overall leverage was greater. In a sense, all this debt owed its existence to another kind of near-cult following that Merriweather had acquired. This one made up of banks and brokerage firms enamored with the prospect of lending to him. Creditors love customers who are big, active, and solid, and that was precisely the image that long-term capital projected. Most of the fund's creditors do not appear to have looked critically at its leverage. In fact, many were accommodating in granting favorable terms on loans, the waiving of collateral, for example. Many also happily entered into derivatives contracts with the fund, increasing their total exposure to what, unknown to them, was about to become a train wreck. This year of the wreck, 1998, began calmly enough. But in May, volatile markets cost the fund a 6% loss, and in June, another 10%. Those lashes of the whip, unheard of in the fund's history, were enough to make Merriweather shoot off a special letter to his investors. It said that LTCM was, quote, understandably disappointed with the May and June results, but nevertheless believed that, quote, the future expected returns for the fund's investment strategies are good. In July, the fund was essentially flat. And then came August. Terrible, terrible August. Russia devalued its currency, and the world's investors fled to quality. That was not what LTCM had been banking on in several different trading strategies. For example, it had at some point done paired trades that, in essence, bet on a narrowing of the spread between the yields of AA-rated corporate bonds and comparable U.S. Treasuries. The bet looked good because the spread was relatively wide compared with its historical levels. But when the flight to quality began, Treasury yields plunged, and the gap between government and corporate yields dramatically and incredibly widened still more. The outcome was disastrous. The fund lost 40% of its capital in August alone, leaving it with just $2.5 billion. Astoundingly, it was still carrying about $100 billion in debt. Around this time, the fund's principals and at least some creditors got really nervous. Stuffing their pride into the closet for the moment, the LTCM crew went on a search for investors who might buy out some of their trading positions or, alternatively, put fresh capital into the fund, thereby giving it a stronger base. The team solicited, among others, certain investors who'd been pushed out of the firm in 1997, as well as the hedge fund moguls George Soros and Julian Robertson. All said no. On the night of Sunday, August 23rd, LTCM opened the Omaha front. The man assigned to call Buffett was Eric Rosenfeld, an LTCM principal and one-time Salomon trader who had earned Buffett's regard by loyally helping Salomon climb out of its hole after the 1991 crisis. Rosenfeld, 45, is normally laid back, but on this occasion, Buffett says there was a sense of urgency in Rosenfeld's offer to sell him some of the fund's large equity arbitrage positions. Buffett said no. By Wednesday, Rosenfeld was back on the phone, joined this time by Merriweather. Could Buffett meet the following morning in Omaha with still another LTCM principal, Lawrence Hillebrand? At the meeting, Hillebrand, 39, also a former Salomon trader, well regarded by Buffett, presented a rough, though still guarded, picture of the long-term capital's portfolio and urged Buffett to become a large investor in the fund. Hillebrand also pinpointed a reason for hurry. When August ended a few days later, the fund was going to have to tell its investors and lenders how much it had lost for the month, and would be pleased to tell them also that it had secured financing arrangements that would ease the fund's leverage. Sorry, said Buffett politely, but he simply had no interest. Later, Buffett talked to Berkshire's vice chairman, Charles Munger, and remembers telling him that though the fund's positions might have been logical, he had no desire to make Berkshire a hedge fund investor. He also pointed out the absurdity of, quote, 10 or 15 guys with an average IQ of maybe 170 getting themselves into a position where they can lose all their money. After that, Buffett did not again think much about long-term capital until late Friday afternoon, September 18, when he returned a call from Goldman Sachs partner he knew, Peter Krause. Krause said that long-term capital's net assets, its capital, had sunk to $1.5 billion, and that Goldman was calling around looking for people who might want to become big investors in the fund. No interest, Buffett said once again. But the two men then bounced around other ideas relating to long-term capital. Finally, Buffett got to focusing on the very big-picture thought that Berkshire and Goldman might jointly bid for the entire fund, chuck the Merriweather management, and take on the fund's management themselves. The concept, says Buffett today, was to patiently stick with most of the fund's positions and gradually liquidate at what Buffett thought could be a decent profit. It was a major idea, of a size suitable for Berkshire's billions in available cash, but it could not have come at a worse time. Buffett was trying to leave his office to get to a granddaughter's birthday party. That night he was scheduled to fly to Seattle to join a Bill Gates group that was going to spend nearly 2 weeks touring Alaska and a galaxy of western parks. It was a highly uncharacteristic move. Buffett ordinarily had no interest in scenery of any kind. but his close friendship with Gates had lured him and his wife, Susan, into signing on for the trip. If a bid was to be made, then Buffett would have to work it out with Krause over the phone from the wild. And that's how it happened, although not without moments of exquisite frustration. Suffice it to say that not even a mega-billionaire can establish and keep a phone connection from the canyon-like depths of an Alaskan fjord. Nevertheless, the $4 billion bid took shape over 4 hectic days, with Goldman declining to be more than a $300 million partner with AIG, at Buffett's suggestion, asked in. That invitation occurred because Buffett has had good relations with AIG's chairman Maurice Hank Greenberg, and thought this gesture might further cement them. Another facet of the deal called for Goldman to be the fund's administrator once the property was in the bidding group's hands. It is essential to understand what the group proposed to buy and at what price. It wanted to own the fund's entire portfolio, and to accomplish that, it wished to purchase the master fund, Long-Term Capital Portfolio LP. This is the fund that had $1.5 billion of capital on Friday, September 18th. By the following Wednesday, though, when the Buffett bid was made, the fund's net assets were maybe in the range of $600 million. Nobody knew for sure. In any case, Buffett, never a man to overpay, wanted to buy the fund at a discount, and his bid was $250 million. Had it been accepted, the sum would have gone to the fund's old investors, Meriwether's management team included, and would have tactically said that a fund worth $4.7 billion at the start of 1998 had sunk in value to about a 20th of that. Once the $250 million was paid over, the Buffett Group would have immediately put up an additional $3.75 billion, which would have restored capital adequacy to the fund. Think a bit more about the $250 million. Once it went on the table, it would become the figure that Meriwether, given time, would quite understandably try to shop, looking for more dollars. Also, when you are talking a $4 billion proposition and the markets are turbulent, it is not good to let a bid sit around and go stale. So Buffett put a tight time limit on his offer. The bid was faxed to Meriwether at 11:40 on Wednesday morning, and he was advised it would expire within an hour at 12:30. Meanwhile, McDonough and the creditors' group had already been trying for days to assemble its rescue plan and were meeting again that day. So even before the bid was faxed to Meriwether that morning, Goldman briefed McDonough on the deal, and McDonough called Buffett, now at a Montana ranch, to confirm the offer. Buffett says that McDonough seemed elated at the sudden appearance of an alternative plan to the one he'd been nursing with the creditors. Buffett then called Meriwether and told him a bid was on its way. Buffett made it clear that his group wanted to buy Long-Term Capital Portfolio in its entirety. Meriwether was non-committal. But when the call ended, Meriwether went into action, fast. After a quick conversation with LTCM's in-house lawyer, he got on the phone to McDonough and told him that Buffett's bid wouldn't work because Meriwether did not have the authority to sell. Meriwether is a general partner of the so-called portfolio company, but it also has other partners, and Meriwether contended he would have to seek the vote of each one before agreeing to sell. And obviously, he said, that could not be done before 12:30. Backing Meriwether up in the conversation was another LTCM principal and a former colleague of McDonough's, David Mullins, who was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board until he joined LTCM in 1994. Buffett's group had not gone into its bid without its own legal opinion. Studying the long-term capital documents available, incomplete though they were, The group's lawyers concluded that the bid was workable from Meriwether's side. Besides, everyone on the Buffett side believed that if Meriwether really had any interest in the bid, he could tentatively accept it and then tangle with the complications later. But Meriwether displayed absolutely no interest when he spoke to McDonough. The Fed president concluded that he could not dismiss Meriwether's legal argument, or, for that matter, stretch his authority as a central banker to force Meriwether to sell. Resignedly, McDonough returned to his surly band of creditors and flogged along their $3.6 billion rescue plan. How do Meriwether and the fund's other investors fare under that scheme? Part of the answer is they keep whatever shrunken capital they still have in the fund, which totaled something around $400 million in late September. That is the correct figure to compare with Buffett's $250 million, though it is worth mentioning that Buffett was to hand over cash, whereas the $400 million remains tied up in the fund. As for Meriwether and the LTCM crew, they still run the fund, though the creditors have roughly halved their fees. The creditors have also put 6 of their people in LTCM's offices with instructions to liquidate the fund as fast as it can be sensibly done. Finishing within a year would be splendid, says one senior Wall Streeter. There is, of course, another scenario. A prompt move by the creditors to find a bidder. A Buffett, say, who would step up and take this mess off their hands immediately. Would Buffett do that? Who knows? Since he never telegraphs his moves, but he is aware that certain creditors have been thinking about him. In any event, Buffett has returned from vacation, and he managed to catch C-SPAN's October 1st coverage of the House hearings on long-term capital. The vignette he liked best? Congressman James Leach's memory that his father had told him to avoid anyone doing business out of the Cayman Islands. That reminded Buffett of a favorite line that seems just about the perfect wrap-up for long-term capital. You never know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out.